Been a long time coming, guys, but welcome to my channel. For those that don't know me, my name's Sam James, and I run my own real estate buyers agency named Compound Invest. Now, cut me a little bit of slack because this is my first YouTube video ever, so I'm probably going to make a few little mistakes here. Now, before I get into a lot of detail, which this video will be very detailed, I'm just going to give everyone a bit of insight in my own actual story. Now, I think it's important because you'll understand after hearing it how I've got to where I've got to, and also the actual knowledge behind all of the strategy and the actual numbers behind purchasing the right property. Now, a little bit about me is that, look, I grew up in a very working class home in Sydney's inner southwest. My father is a Vietnamese immigrant, and my mother is from a farming background from the Northern Rivers in New South Wales. Now, throughout basically my whole life, we haven't really been handed much, and we had to work for pretty much everything, which I'm very grateful for. In school, I went down to Endeavour Sports High School, down in Caringbah towards the Sutherland Shire. And then I eventually did go to uni, where I studied both law and finance. Now, over this time, I was always interested in property, but I never went down the route. Though what happened is I, post-uni, started working for a few large multinational companies and also a few small and medium enterprises. And over that time, I actually began building up my own portfolio. Now, what I learned there was that buying is so important, and especially buying correctly is really even more important. Now, I had really good success over this time, where I continually refinanced and also used equity to fund future purchases. Now, post getting a fair few runs on the board, and by a few runs, I mean an actual national portfolio, I began my own real estate buyers agency, with an actual proven strategy and runs on the board. Now, look, a little bit more about me is I love sport, I love cricket, soccer, I surf quite a lot. I really like the UFC, and I just generally love dealing with people face to face. So it's quite good being in a service-based industry, where face to face is the main part of your job. Now, look, I do have a few reasons for starting this channel. Now, look, the biggest issue I've got at the moment is that there's a lot of very bad advice out there. And I hate to say it like that, but it's just the truth. Now, I like to say it that, there's a lot of KFC workers that are pretending to be real estate agents, and it's just the truth. Now, look, the reason I actually really want people to actually see this is actually, it's not to make any necessary sales or make a ton of money or anything like that. It's actually to help people create freedom in their lives through actual financial freedom. Now, if you have, let's say, one or two properties in your life, your house may burn down that you're living in at the moment. Let's say it's an investment, or let's say your parents' house might burn down, or something might go really wrong in life, and you can actually help them out. You can literally house them and everything's going to be okay. And just having that sense of security is such an important thing in the world we live in, especially with the cost of things these days. It's just crazy. Aside from that, also the right purchase can continually be leveraged in perpetuity, and it will transform someone's life. Making a mistake in property, look, mistakes cost so much time and money. It's not even funny. Like, to turn over a house, you're realistically looking at, from the actual first appraisal to signing up to getting it listed to actually settling, it's probably realistically 3 months or so. So it's quite a long time. And, that opportunity cost of purchasing something that, let's say, does 3% less on average over the course of 20 years to another is hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, depending on your purchase price. Now, what I see in the market at the moment is you get a lot of basically buyers agents that are really rubbish, saying the most typical buzzwords you will ever hear. Now, I'll give you two of them. And first one is you'll hear under market value. Now, market value truly only is what the bank actually values the property at, because that's what's underwriting the actual loan and is saying that it would sell for this at this exact date date in time. Now, you can go on CoreLogic, you can go on PropTracker, you can go on Domain, you can go on realestate.com.au and make it out as if your property's worth more, but what it's really worth is what the bank values it at. So that's one thing. And the second thing I'd ask you is, you hear a lot of people saying, you know, I bought a couple of properties under market value in this suburb. Now, if that's the case, what does it say about the future potential of the suburb? That's what I'd ask. Secondly, the other thing you'll hear all the time is off market. Now, do I purchase off market? Yes, I do. Does it mean all my best deals come off market? Some do, but not all of them. Now, you could, for example, if you're, let's say you're Brisbane based and we're just talking about a suburb called Wilston in the sort of inner north of Brisbane. Now, you could probably walk into someone's house and say, hey, I'm going to pay you 20 million bucks, and they'll sign the contract tomorrow because they know it's not worth that. Just because it's off market doesn't mean it's at fair value or it's of good value. So that's what I think is really important for everyone to know. And finally, just with that, success that most buyers agents or other property professionals chase is very short term. Now, I'd say 99% or more probably chase this. And yes, you can pick a few suburbs that do well over the short term, though longer term, this does come with consequences. So that's what I'm more worried about here if people do continue to do these sorts of things, and you'll see this in detail a lot later on in this video. Anyway, let's get cut to the chase and actually begin. Now, excuse me if it's a little bit slow, but I'll just share a few notes I've put in here. So look, the key topics I'll be covering today is, firstly, what are the true fundamentals that drive markets and what my unique strategy is. Secondly, whilst both are important, capital growth is significantly more important than cash flow. Thirdly, what are the top markets in Australia and why? Number 4, why the housing shortage is set to continue long into the future. Number 5, whilst timing is important, purchasing the right asset is more important. Let's get to it. Now, what are the true fundamentals that drive markets? Now, it's not as simple as supply and demand. Whilst a lot of people would like to say it's supply and demand, and yes, it does play a part, no doubt. What it really is a shortage of supply or scarcity of supply combined with excess demand from a wealthy income demographic. Now, probably the first thing that's most important to know is that demographics drive markets. Now, let's get straight into this because you'll see exactly what I mean almost immediately. Now, let's go to Sydney, for example. Now, those darker blue and lighter blue sections and the sort of greeny teal sections are of higher income. So the dark blue is your highest income. Yeah, basically yellow and red are your lowest income. Now, if we look at this, you can see clearly that the lower North Shore and the eastern suburbs have most of the wealth income demographic in Sydney. And you can also see that it's developing sort of towards Birchgrove, Balmain, out towards Newtown, Ashfield Way. And then you've got also pockets of both the lower St. George region and Sutherland Shire that are developing and have fairly good wealth income demographics. So these drive markets, especially in Sydney. You look at the lower North Shore, upper eastern suburbs, inner west, they're all the top markets in Australia if you look at it that way. Let's just go to Melbourne now. So you can see the old money towards the inner east, so Hawthorn, Camberwell, Canterbury, that kind of area, then out towards Brighton as well. You've got also developing pockets sort of in the inner city, so that's around East Melbourne, Carlton, Collingwood, Richmond, Cremorne. Then you can see sort of Williamstown, Footscray, Seddon, slowly gentrifying and starting to get sort of more blue there as well. Now, Sydney and Melbourne are a little bit different in the sense that you do have income in both areas where you do have higher income demographics actually in weird pockets. Now, Brisbane is quite different to that in the sense that almost all of Brisbane's wealth is centered around the CBD. Now, I'll show you what I mean by that. Now, if you look here, you've basically got all the wealth centered around the inner north, the inner east, pockets of the inner west like Ashgrove, and then out towards Fig Tree Pocket as well. Now, this is where almost all the capital growth occurs in Brisbane. Basically, the further and further out you go, generally the cheaper and cheaper, or should I say the lower the income demographic gets. Not exactly the same as somewhere like Sydney or Melbourne, where you won't see on the map, but if you look up towards Dural and that kind of way, there is quite expensive suburbs out there. And in Melbourne, you also have places like Park Orchards that are quite expensive as well. Now, this is really important for markets because if someone's got more money in a market, then they can afford to do subdivisions, they can afford to update their house, renovate their house, redevelop their house, which then pushes prices up. And generally, these markets are very tightly held, so LVRs are actually very low. So that's what actually drives the market further as well. Now, let's go to the next sort of key part. Now, the key thing you want to do is buy in industries with regions with fundamentally sound industries. Now, what I mean by that is industries that are always going to be there, industries that are pretty much required no matter what, and are often funded by the government. So these are your key industries that in my eyes probably work best. So medical and healthcare, hospitals create great capital growth in a lot of circumstances. Banking, finance is another one. Legal, IT, education, science, technology, engineering, construction, and infrastructure. Now, one industry you'll notice that I have left off there is mining, and this is the exact reason why. Now, if anyone's bought in Port Hedland in about 2012, you probably want to turn your head away now because you're not going to be very happy to see what comes next. So this is an example of Port Hedland. What happened post that early 2010s mining boom? So you can see in about 2012 to about 2013, the median price close to $1.2 million. Now, that fell off the absolute wayside over the next 6 or 7 years, where properties actually fell right down to 400 to 500,000, 500,000, let's just call it. That's not too bad, but yeah, like you can see it's lost a lot of value there. And look, generally speaking, your fundamentally strong markets don't lose any more than 10% or so. But this is just ridiculous, and it gets even worse if you look at the rental prices. You had places renting for, about 2,000 a week to 2,500 a week in that time. They dropped right down to 600 or so dollars, and mind you, the vacancy rate went well over 10%. So it was actually terrible. It was terrible for anyone that bought there. Now, people can see it recovering a little bit, but this is the exact reason why you don't buy there. And there's actually lending restrictions on a lot of these sorts of postcodes, so you do need to look out for that as well. Anyway, moving on from that, look, a key part of this is the lifestyle triangle to a lot of suburbs. Now, what that means is it's basically time that takes to go from work to school and to lifestyle districts and then back home. So anything under 20 minutes is generally really good. Under 10 minutes is exceptional. And an example of a suburb that I'm going to give people here is New Farm in Brisbane. So it's one of the best suburbs in the whole state and country, actually, in saying that as well. Now, for New Farm, for example, work generally, a lot of people in New Farm will either work from home, they'll either work in Fortitude Valley or the CBD, which all lie either within 2 or 3 Ks of where you are. Some people also work in sort of your Woolloongabba South Bank district, which is only also a couple of Ks away, or Cannon Hill, which is only about 15, 20 minutes away as well. So that is great. The schools around there are exceptional. So you have a few very good public schools that are nearby, such as Brisbane Central's one, New Farm State Schools is another, and also you've got in nearby Spring Hill, both Brisbane Girls and Brisbane Grammar School. Then shortly also you've got St Margaret's down in Ascot as well. So you covered on basically all bases. They're all about 10 minutes or so away from New Farm. Now, your lifestyle is basically exceptional there as well. You've got Story Bridge literally walkable distance away, and you've also got the riverfront track that actually runs over the river there too. One of the most popular and scenic areas of all of Brisbane. You've got New Farm Park, which is very popular, Victoria Park, very close by too. Then your lifestyle districts of the city, Fortitude Valley and South Bank, literally just minutes away. So that is an exceptional area to buy, and being so, that is why it is so expensive and continues to go up in value. Now, let's get further. Now, proximity to the CBD and water is something. Now, look, There's a conception that the proximity to CBD is the only factor and the water is the only factor too. No, it's not, but it does play a large part. So here's an example of your prices in every city based on the CBD from the water. Now, your key markets, especially your Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane's, you can see how expensive the prices are based on how far they are from the city here. Now, this is quite a general approach, but you get the idea. Now, a couple of examples I'll just give you here, which have the perfect mix of both being close to the CBD and the water, and they're basically the most expensive suburbs you can see in the whole country and the cities as well. So Bellevue Hills one, right between the CBD and Bondi Beach, great employment around there, iconic areas. Point Piper's another one, right next to Bellevue Hill, literally the most expensive suburb in the whole country. And a couple of others is New Farm, as I just discussed, right by the river and the CBD. Peppermint Grove in Perth. I think a lot of people will know that as the Monaco of Perth. If anyone's ever heard that before, that's what a lot of people call it. Battery Point in Hobart's also another one. So right by the CBD and the water. So you know there is some merit to that, should I say? Now, furthermore to this, now a really important thing that's been coming up in recency as well is actual school zones of regions and actual suburbs. Now, look, a key part of this is often wealthy families like to live near other wealthy families, number one. And also, especially in Sydney and Melbourne and somewhat Brisbane as well, you've got quite wealthy migrants that come in and generally like sending the kids to the expensive private schools, particularly, and sometimes just generally particular school zones for families that don't send their kids to private schools, for example, but just want to be in catchment zones. Now, let's go to an actual map so I can show you exactly what I'm talking about here. Now, I'll give you the three cities again as well, just so it's clear and easy to understand. Now, here we go with Sydney. Now, in Sydney, for example, you can see the heat map of where all the best schools are. So you can see mainly around the eastern suburbs, Lower North Shore and West, is a high congregation of really good schools. Now, in saying that, an example of this is people that live in Stanmore. You're very close to Newington College, which is also very highly rated, and also Fort Street. So that's a selective school which is very highly rated and performs very well. So a lot of families will happily move to places like Stanmore simply to get in those zones. Now, an example of this in Melbourne would be somewhere like McKinnon High and the suburb like Ormond. Now, a lot of Ormond is basically zoned into McKinnon High. So a lot of families will basically be going at each other just to simply get into the market. Now, it's crazy because your capital growth in that catchment zone sometimes can be up to 20% more over the course of 10 years than not in the catchment zone, which is just incredible. But anyway, it does play a big part. Now, this Ormond is also surrounded by quite good schools as well, private schools too. So Haileybury's one in Brighton. You got Scotch College not overly far away as well, or Melbourne Grammar School. They're all very close. So that's another reason. Caulfield Grammar is also very close too. Now in Brisbane, a really good example is somewhere like Spring Hill. So Spring Hill is very close to Brisbane Girls, very highly rated. Brisbane Grammar's there as well. And you've also got St Margaret's in Ascot that is literally 5-10 minutes away. So families will literally go over the top of everyone simply to just get in those school zones. Really important part of capital growth and actually really strong fundamentals for the market. Now, another key part is transport infrastructure. Now, it's not the only thing, but it does assist in the lifestyle triangle. Now, it's not necessarily the distance to a station or anything like that, but it's more the convenience of where that station is and the services to that station. Now, an example of this would be for Sydney side is Parramatta and Clyde. Now, Parramatta is actually further away from the CBD, and it's actually probably, I'd argue, have a little bit lower demographics than somewhere like Clyde. But Parramatta has better capital growth than Clyde simply because of the main train line being there and the infrastructure there. Now, generally, the more methods of transport, the better. Now, simply being, it's just because people can get to and from one place, one another a lot easier. And then that makes it more in demand for more people, therefore meaning more demand, higher prices, especially if there's not much stock. Now, just to the next one, let's just have a look. Density restrictions and zoning. That's also another one. Now, what I mean by that is supply and demand is a very simple metric that people use, which obviously does have a large effect to the extent of if the wealthy demographic is coming in and trying to purchase and there's an undersupply, prices generally go up. Now, restrictive zoning makes that even worse. Now, the reason being is because it creates less supply in the future. And not only that too, but your NIMBY councils are really, pretty bad at this as well. So a good example of that is places like your Woollahra Council in Sydney, your Strathfield Council in Sydney, some pockets of, St Kilda and Melbourne. Those are good examples. Now, I'll give you an exact example. Here, it's your North Wollongong suburbs versus your Shellharbour suburbs. Now, if you try to develop anything in somewhere like Bulli North to Austin Mere or anywhere like that, you're probably going to be met with basically objection groups. The council will be very reluctant to let you do it, and therefore that leads to a higher demand to supply ratio, which leads to higher prices. Now, on top of that, Shellharbour is a good example of somewhere where it's quite development pro. So you're naturally going to have more supply there of more dwellings. Therefore, you'll have a lower demand to supply ratio. Now, if you look at the past performance of these markets, you'll notice that basically your North Wollongong suburbs have way outperformed your Shellharbour suburbs, and this is a large reason for it. Now, there's an actual heat map here of density. And you can see the darker blue basically there is an example of where there's lower density, and your sort of yellowy color is lower density. So if you look towards particularly the southern end there, towards Warilla and Barak Heights, you'll notice that it is quite dense there, despite most of it not having units. And the reason for that is greater zoning and ability. Now, that's basically a few key fundamentals, not the only fundamentals, but I'll move on to my actual unique strategy. Now, what I do is probably different to nearly everyone else that you will see, that being because I do things in a way that I've learned over a long course of time that has been very successful. Now, for me, the way I run my business is I don't actually focus on anything to do with actually making a sale. The most important thing to me is actually the relationship that I have between me and my clients. Now, in saying that, the biggest thing for me is you have to have a really good importance of understanding both the client circumstances and what I can do for you. Now, if that doesn't match up, that's okay. But if it does match up, I think we're probably a very good fit. Now, the thing I understand is that everyone's different. Now, in saying that, what I mean by that is that someone who earns $300,000 a year should not invest the same as someone that earns $100,000 a year or someone that earns $70,000 a year. You have very different abilities to buy, you have very different serviceability, and you also probably have very different risk profiles and tolerance. A bigger part to that too is also the time horizon and risk appetite that you actually have. Now, furthermore to that, those aren't the only things that are important, but actually the other two things that I'd say are really important that come in here is that I will only purchase houses and no units. Now, this is an extract from a really good report that I like. So it's the Aussie Home Loans 25-year report, which clearly shows houses outperforming units. And if you want to look on the basically bottom to bottom right-hand side, you'll see in basically every city of the country, houses have outperformed units by quite a country mile. So that's my reason. And I don't think there's any arguments there. Now, furthermore to that, look, importantly in buying properties, I have a very strong focus on sustainable portfolio growth. Now, let me tell you something. What I mean by that is it's both net yield and net growth are your most important things. Now, you'll see that. Look, I put a quote down there saying that you are buying a property to make money, to have convenience of access, and to bolster your future, not to save on tax. Now, what I mean by that is if you're an investor, you're literally buying it to make money. Nothing else should matter but what your actual net amount that you make is over the long term. Now, I'm a strong believer that if you're buying a property, you should have the intention of holding it forever, if not at least 10 years. So it really is a long-term asset that you should think about over a very long course of time. Now, what do I mean by net yield? Now, what I mean is you'll see all these other people saying, oh, I bought a property that's 6.5% yield in North Queensland, for example. But what they're leaving out is, first things first, you'll find the council rates are very expensive there. Now, if you're only getting $400 a week in rent and you're getting $3,800 in literally council bills a year, which is realistic for that area, if not more, then that's shrinking your yield quite a lot. Now, if you're then having to pay insurance, and that being both either building or building and landlord insurance, in your southern states, you're generally spending anywhere from about $1,200 to about $1,800. Let's call it at about a $300,000 price point. Now, in North Queensland, that would be about $4,000 to give everyone an idea. So that's even making it worse. Now, furthermore, too, in your southern states, your actual landlord managing agents fee is generally somewhere around the 4 to about 8%. Now, in North Queensland, for this example's sake, it's generally somewhere around the 10 to 15%. So that's even shrinking your yield more. So your net yield actually for something that might be 6.5% will probably be even to something in an eastern state that might even be towards your lower 4 percentage point mark, just simply because of the amount you're spending on it. Now, furthermore to this, your net growth is most important. Now, what's your net growth? It's your actual increase in price over time that from your purchase price. It's just a capital growth that's happened over the course of time. Now, if you ever go to sell, who cares about paying tax? If you're making a lot of money, who cares about paying tax? That's the thing. Like, it's okay to pay tax if you've made a lot of money. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, much aside from a lot of your other people that will say, just, oh, buy this for tax purposes, buy this for this, buy this for that. Now, why would you make a financial decision to save money? You're making an investment to make money. So really simple there, but I think you get the gist of it. Lastly, this adds on to this further. Now, I will not touch house and land packages. Now, look, the funny thing about this is that I've actually been offered quite a lot of money from some developers in multiple states. So I've actually been offered, in one circumstance, $44,000 to sell house and land packages. Now, the thing about me is I can't be bought. I will only buy things that actually benefit my clients. Now, I have never bought a house and land package, heard nightmare stories, are just a complete disaster, and here's some of the reasons. Now, you've got poor building quality, number one. Some of these are just built with ridiculously poor terracotta tiles, particularly ridiculously poor wood. You look at the age lines on the wood, it's just an absolute joke. Seriously. Land components are a disgrace. I don't know if people like living in backyards, they're surely not it. I've seen backyards under, not backyards, sorry, blocks actually, which is even more ridiculous, under 280 meters squared now. So what are you going to do with that? And furthermore, there's no differentiation between your actual property and others. They look exactly the same. So what's going to differentiate your property in the future from another, let's say, estate that's nearby? If you're buying in one estate that's built and you're buying a new 4x2 house and land package, and let's say in 5 years you want to sell and a suburb 2 minutes away has just been built, but it's brand new, what's going to differentiate your property from that property? There's no demand from it for it really, because they're just going to pick a new property, and it's just basically recurring cycle until basically those suburbs are entirely built out and the LVRs come down. So that's the next thing. They have very high LVRs. There's a thing called mortgage belt suburbs. So what that basically means is suburbs with a very high LVR. Now, during times of crisis, these are very badly affected. Now, the reason being is because these people are stretched to their limits and they generally do not have many funds to actually get through these times. So you'll often see a lot of houses for sale there. Now, furthermore to this, you also have very poor services and infrastructure. Now, I had a friend who used to live out in Western Sydney. Now, this is an estate, I'm not going to name it, but this was an estate that was fairly recently built. And there was about probably 4 fairly new suburbs around it too. Now, there was a Coles Express, to one Coles Express to service these 4 suburbs and probably more than 10,000 people. Like, what the fuck are you going to do with a Coles Express, seriously, to service 10,000 people? And the roads are just a disgrace there as well. It just not built for purpose, very bad traffic in and out. I think it took about 2 hours to just get into the Sydney CBD every day. And it was just a joke. So, you know, why the hell would you want to live there out of everywhere else? Now, to just give everyone an idea, this is an example of an area in Sydney. As you can see, this is in 2014. You can see it's fairly rural, a couple of houses there, you know, a few no new lots being subdivided. This is what it looks like will look like in 2021. Now, you tell me that you'd want to live in a suburb that's surrounded by ridiculous open land that's about to be subdivided again. You've got rocks in your head simply because what's going to happen is you're going to have future supply coming in, which then throws out exactly what I was talking about before, being that your actual demand to supply ratio is completely out. There's just too much supply. So that's a really key thing there. Now, well, if that doesn't explain it enough to you, I don't know what will, because that's more that should be more than enough as to why you should not buy in these new estates. Now, onto the next section. So, the next section here is actually why capital growth is significantly more important than cash flow. Now, don't get me wrong, both are definitely important. No doubt both are important. But the reason being is because you've got to remember, yield or cash flow, should I say, is a percentage of your asset value. Therefore, you actually want your asset value to increase over time, so to go up, because your yield is a representation of that. Now, over the course of time, what happens is the best assets generally have lower yield. Now, a good example to explain that is similar to stocks in somewhere like the New York Stock Exchange. So something like Berkshire Hathaway generally has next to no yield, but is very high growth. Now, who really cares if your yield when you bought it was, let's say, 4%, and in 20 years your yield's 2%, right? However, the asset has increased 400% because you're getting 2% of 400% of your original purchase price, which is just going to be ridiculous. So think of it that way, easiest way to describe it. Now, I'm actually going to go into some actual examples just to explain this to people, because, you know, a lot of people will try to go down the rhetoric of, no, that's not true. And I'm going to figure this out on my own because I made a lot of growth since COVID, which is annoying because you could have thrown a map, literally a dart at the Australian map, and basically made 30% in COVID, but it's not going to be the same in the future. But anyway, on to the next. Now, look, basically your best suburbs in Australia generally grow somewhere between 7 and 10%, and yield will generally only do 3 to 4% in the long term. Now, that means it obviously can't keep up with capital growth. Yield will not keep up with it in your best suburbs. Now, look, this is what's going to happen basically in a suburb like that. Now, in essence, what will happen is in these sorts of suburbs, you'll have capital growth going like this, and then yield slowly sliding down like that. Now, the reason for that is because clearly in the numbers, 7 to 10% clearly outdoes 3 to 4%. So you've got growth going higher than yield, so yield slowly slides down. So that's actually the best result. Now, people will often say you need both, and without a doubt, 100% true. But the issue you're going to have is that won't continue the long term in these very poor performing suburbs. Now, if it did, if yield was to do 7 to 10% like capital growth over, let's say, the last 30 or 40 years, you'd have houses leasing for over $3,000 in Australia, which just isn't the case. The average rent, I think, in Australia is something around $650 a week, or maybe $700. I don't know the exact number, but it's something like that. It's definitely not $3,000 a week. So don't believe that rubbish rhetoric. It's just not the truth. Now, let's just go into a little bit more here. A key part that everyone seems to get wrong as well here in property is that it's not actually solely actual yield you want, it's actual serviceable equity, not necessarily cash flow. And the reason why for this is because serviceable equity comes from the equity gained from the growth of property over the course of time. Now, you require both ideally, though without good growth, all you're doing is simply pricing yourself out of better suburbs. Now, it's hard for a lot of people without question. It is very hard to understand this, and it's actually not a fair market at all, to be fair. But the thing you need to understand is that it's actually the system we actually operate in is called capitalism. It's not incomeism. Now, look, a deposit in Australia at the time of actually recording this video is roughly for average in Australia, you need roughly $120,000 to $140,000. Now, if you look at that there, the average time it would take to save, just in general, is nearly 6 years. Now, if you look at basically something from the perspective of saving, let's say even $100,000 to break into one of the cheaper performing better suburbs. Now, most people I'd say would argue that would take at least 5 years, some might argue 7. Now, if you can get into the market and get into the right suburb, what is going to happen is over the course of time, you're going to have basically the equity build up in your property, which will make you $100,000. Now, making $100,000 is way easier than saving $100,000. Now, 20% growth in, let's say, 2 to 4 years for a suburb that's, let's say, $500,000 isn't like uncommon, especially if you know where to buy and what to buy. And that would equate to roughly $100,000 in equity. Now, in the right suburbs, you might have periods of, slowness for a couple of years in both capital growth and rental growth. Though the fact of the matter is they do revert to generally the long-term averages, and you'll generally get both over the long term, which then will help fund future deposits for more properties, and it'll keep you in the market for those better suburbs. If you're buying a suburb that's doing 4% compared to a suburb that's doing 8%, you're just continually pricing yourself out of a better suburb. It's just as simple as that. Now, furthermore, look, I'm actually going to go into an exact example now. Now, this is just unbelievable because I'm going to give a really real life scenario here, and I'm actually going against almost every buyer's agent in the country and in saying a suburb in Townsville. So the suburb I've used is Heatley because there's a lot of data there, and it's quite consistent. It's not your cheapest suburb in Townsville either. So I'm not trying to just nitpick your cheapest suburb just to basically make myself look good. I'm actually picking a suburb where it makes complete sense and I can contrast it. So, and I'm comparing that to somewhere like Footscray in Melbourne, which every single person in the country will say don't buy in Melbourne because it has very poor governance, which I do not disagree with. However, it is also one of the best places to invest your money in Australia at the moment. And not only that, it long-term just performs exceptionally well. So let's have a look. This is an actual example, and this is publicly available information, so I'm not making this up. This is from Domain in the 80s and 90s of both Footscray and Heatley. If you look on the right-hand side, you'll see Footscray, and the left-hand side, you'll see Heatley. Now, they're actually very similar in price, if not even, you could probably even argue that Heatley is actually a little bit more expensive in this time compared to Footscray. Now, go and call someone up who lives in Heatley or property manager, especially if they've been there for more than 30 years, and ask them if they're happy that they bought in Heatley or they're happy they bought in Footscray. I guarantee you they're going to be very unhappy to say that I didn't buy somewhere like Footscray, I want a better suburb. Now, the issue is that people will push these suburbs because in the short term it's very easy to actually make predictions about where things are going to go. You only actually need probably about 10 or so key factors to be going your way. But the fact of the matter is, it might grow 20 to 40% in 2 to 3 years, but if it does nothing for the next 15, you're actually losing money longer term. And look, if you had bought one house in Footscray, let's say 30 years ago, you could literally just on equity buy probably 3 Heatley houses outright, maybe even more if you wanted to actually service them for actually just getting a loan purpose. But anyway, aside from that, let's go to a few graphs just to prove it even further. Now, here's your actual average prices in Footscray at the moment. So you can see as of the moment, we're almost at the $1 million mark. Now, let's compare this to somewhere like Heatley, where you can see it's been about what? That's 14 years, and we've grown somewhere from about, let's say, 330, 350,000 to about $400,000 today. Now, this is just ridiculous, and I don't know how a logical person could say that this is a good purchase. Now, this is probably going to go to $500,000, don't get me wrong, over the next probably 2 years or so, no doubt. Somewhere like that, maybe, and you probably will make money, no doubt. But for someone that's not, for example, on their retirement plan for the next 2 to 5 years, I don't know why the hell you'd buy here in this. And I'll even make this worse for people who want to buy there. Somewhere like Heatley, I think this is. No, sorry, this is Footscray. This is your rent in Footscray. So in 2010, you would have got about $400 a week in rent. Now you're getting somewhere between $650 and $700 a week in rent. You can see fairly consistent growth. A bit of a slow period, obviously, in that COVID period, no doubt because of what happened in Melbourne. But you can see the trend is fairly up in the market here. Let's go to Heatley. You've had rent obviously a little bit lower here of $300 and probably $30 to $350 a week to start with, and now it's closing in on sort of $470 to $500 a week. Now, that's not actually, if we go back, they're not far off there. But you got to remember, back in the time of where I first contrasted in the 80s and 90s, you probably had very similar rent in both of them as well. Now, imagine you had, let's say, $150 a week less cash flow in one market compared to another. Well, it's probably even a little bit more, and I'm just being modest there. Now, it's just ridiculous. Like, looking at this, and in longer term, this is just going to continue. Like, this rent will probably go to $550 a week, then go silent for another 10 years or so. Whereas Footscray might go silent for, let's say, somewhere like, it could go silent for 2 to 4 years, but then it's just going to continue back to its normal 3 to 4% average as the rental increases, right? Now, how irresponsible is it for someone to actually recommend a suburb like this saying you've got long-term growth? Because it's just not the case. Now, anyway, aside from that, I think that explains it enough in detail as to why capital growth is so much more important than something like just simply cash flow, because the numbers just don't stack up long term. And somewhere like Heatley will go back to its average of 4 to 5%. Footscray will do 8.5 to 10%. So there you go. There's a free suburb, everyone. Thank me later. Now, let's just take it a step back. Now, what else is important? Now, look, this is probably the most, I'd say, in-demand section that everyone's asked me to probably make a video on. And what it is what are the top markets and why? Now, look, the way I want to probably go to this is I'll give you a little bit of history as to what's basically happened and why basically we've eventuated to these markets being the top markets, and then furthermore, why it's going to continue on and into the future. Now, to give everyone an idea, in the 1970s, President Nixon in the States, which is something that we actually follow quite closely, took the dollar off the gold standard. Now, what happened with that is the governments around the world, especially the Western world, continue to just devaluate their currency. Now, and what they basically did was continued printing money and overinflating the economy. Now, the only solution basically that the governments had when any crisis was to occur was to just inflate the debt away and print more money. That's all they've done, and that's all that's going to happen in the future again. Now, there's a few really good examples here. First is your stock market crash of 87. Second's your dot-com bubble. Third's your actual GFC, which was ridiculous, and even more ridiculous has been your recent coronavirus with your inflating of markets, and which has been underpinned really by the amount of cash that's circulated in the economy. So anyway, that's basically what's happened. Now let's just go into a few graphs of how much they've actually inflated things over time. Now, if we'll just wait and see how it goes. Now, here's an example of what's happened since basically 1970. Now, I couldn't find an actual graph well on the Australian market, but if you look to the right here, this is one of the US market, and the Australian one is very closely correlated to that. And I can tell you, it looks almost exactly the same as that. I've read the data, and look, the graph almost represents it perfectly. Now, if you look at the bottom of basically the right-hand graph, you will see that where the dollar was taken off the gold standard. Now, you can see almost immediately since World War II there, at the end of it in 1945, obviously there was more money in the economy, and that's simply because governments needed to actually create more money, and there was and simply because of the baby boom and a major population boom. So that's why. But from about 1945 right through to 1970, it was fairly stagnant. But look at what happened since 1970, and look at what's happened in every single crisis basically since 1970, and it's just ridiculous. And if you did that to 2024, it would only pretty much go up the way it's been going since from basically the 90s right through to 2020. Now, on the left-hand side is an actual script, well, not script, but it's actual photo of a newspaper in Australia in the 1970s. Now, I actually had a photo from a small chalkboard put up in my actual uncle's 60th birthday. We had in Woody Head, nice spot, by the way. And I wanted to take a photo of that, but I had a bit of personal information that I didn't want to share. So that's why I've used this newspaper here. But anyway, wouldn't mind having coffee and spaghetti for 30 and 15 cents. But that's basically what happens when governments overinflate things. I don't think you could even get probably a spaghetti for under $2 now. So if you look at that, that's more than 10x since then, which is just ridiculous. So, a roast chicken for $1. I'd probably live on that if I could. But anyway, look, furthermore to this, it's not only that, but what underpins a lot of Australia's best suburbs also is Australia's migration, especially the migration of high net worth individuals. Now, we're basically the mecca of it in the world. Now, if you look at this, this is in 2023 where the most high net worth individuals came. Now, you got to remember, so Australia's only got, what, 27 million people now? I think it had 26 million in 2023. So if you compare that, we are literally the mecca for it in the world, probably behind especially the major nations. Per capita, the UAE and probably Singapore are above us. But for your major developed nations, it's definitely Australia's number one. Definitely New Zealand number two with their population as well. And they basically only will go to your key major cities in Australia. So that's your Sydneys and your Melbournes. So, and also Brisbane too, actually, especially with the Olympics coming on and the increase in tech businesses developing there, and actual just the economy there is quite good as well for it. Your Singapore and UAE are just basically city states, so I wouldn't even count them as a major nation. But anyway, that's another reason. Now, furthermore to that, you've actually got holding periods. So what that is the time that the average person takes to sell their home is actually increasing over time. So if you look at the top areas of Australia, this is just over the last 10 years, between the years of 2010 and 2020, you can see that basically we've gone from, and I'd say an average for our top three cities of Australia, Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. I'm not counting the ACT because I just don't like the ACT. It's as simple as that. I think it's the worst capital you could have picked in Australia. But anyway, you could see an average of probably, let's say 8 or so, maybe 8.5 years. Now it's going to an average of well over 11 years. Now, what's happening is even in your better suburbs, that's even higher. So properties are turning over less and less in these areas. And what that's creating is you've got the same demand, if not more, because of the population increase, and everyone want to live in the same area, and you've got less supply. So that creates higher prices, therefore. So, that's a large reason why these sort of cities are performing better, and especially certain pockets in a lot of cities. Now, furthermore to this, look, the backbone of Australia really is real estate. Now, the housing market alone, and I'm talking residential, is worth over $10 trillion. Now, that's just ridiculous because it makes up more than 50% of our entire net wealth. Now, if you add the commercial market onto this as well, you've got $2.2 trillion on top of that as well. Now, if we look at super funds too, they've got trillions of dollars as well, by which a lot of that is actually backed up in real estate too. So the number's actually even higher. But I don't have the exact stat for that, but anyway, that's just a little bit more information there. Now look, the vast majority of wealth in Australia is stored in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, which represents over 80% of the property wealth. Now, what I mean by this, I'm including the Sydney Basin region. So that's basically from Shell Harbour to Newcastle. So that's basically a lot of the population, and I'm also including basically your Sunshine Coast to the Gold Coast there too. So look, that's about 80% of the property wealth in Australia there. Furthermore, now these are more of the things that people are attracted to. So why has there been a flight to these quality locations? Very simple. Level of income growth and availability of jobs. If there's high income there and there's a lot of jobs, people are going to naturally move there. Very simple. People need money to live. Future growth prosperity is one. Generally states that have, should I say, very consumer-based economy. Now, that's in Sydney and Melbourne. You'll notice that businesses will start up there quite a lot because they need people to buy their services. International demand, particularly businesses. Now, look, in Sydney and Melbourne, they're basically international commodities. So you have businesses stationing their entire Southern Hemisphere headquarters here. You've got companies like Deloitte that have huge offices. You have companies, for example, like BlackRock, for example. Whilst I don't like the company, they still got them there. You've got other companies like Xero. You have companies like Microsoft that have huge offices. Google in Sydney and Melbourne, for example. You've got some are in Brisbane too, don't get me wrong, especially with the Olympics coming on its way. So I'm not excluding it there. Another thing, services, facilities, transport. I've spoken about that before. If you've got some of the best services there, for example, doctors, medical health professionals, you've got really good lawyers, you've got really good architects, you've got good builders, you've got really good transport network. People will move there simply because of the ease of getting around, and just the lifestyle's just better there. Thirdly, primary, secondary, and private school zones. I just explained that earlier, but basically, if you've got the best school zones, wealthy families move there, and the reason they move there is because they want to send their kids to good schools. Also, get for them to network with other either future high net worth people or present high net worth people. That's the reason. Now, also, if you've got very highly rated education, tertiary education, so universities there, it comes as a big part of it. Now, for example, you've got places like in Melbourne, you have places in the Yarra Council region, the close to the University of Melbourne. You've got very high demand from internationals there, simply wanting to send their kids to university there. And you've also got other families that want to send their kids to local private schools. Then, therefore, after that, they can go to uni, which is nearby too. Furthermore, an exceptional lifestyle. So if you're close to really good lifestyle precincts, exceptional beaches, exceptional waterways, exceptional, should I say, bars, restaurants, facilities, that plays a big part too. So, for example, people that live in Paddington in Sydney, they have really good, restaurants on Oxford Street in Paddington. They have also the CBD really nearby. So your Opera House, your Harbour Bridge, you've got Bondi Beach close. For people in Brisbane that live somewhere like, should I say, New Farm, you've got, your Fortitude Valley precinct close by. You've got the riverfront there. You've got Howard Smith Wharves very close by too. So all of that has an exceptional lifestyle. So that does play a major part in basically what people look to do. Now, look, I'm going to go into this in greater detail in the future, but basically, your top 100 suburbs from the report I'm going off here, and this isn't only this report. You can actually go into CoreLogic, you can get PropValue, PropTrack, you can go to almost any site, and you'll find over the last 30 or so, or even more years, if you really want to go deeper, you'll find that Melbourne, Sydney are your top performers, and Brisbane's also sprinkled throughout that as well. You have some suburbs of Perth in there too. Now, as you can see in this actual just blurb here, Melbourne actually dominated the highest capital growth suburbs. So Melbourne, of your top 100 suburbs in the Aussie Home Loans 25-year report, actually had 41 entrants, which is incredible. Sydney had 25. Now, without question, let's go to what I know are the prime locations and the best locations to buy in Australia. Now, without question, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane are your top areas to buy in Australia. Now, Sydney, you're talking about areas such as the lower North Shore, very, very strong capital growth over the long term, very good income demographics over the long term. The eastern suburbs is another one, and the inner west is also another one. So as you could see in probably the demographics map earlier in the video, look, it's just an exceptional area to buy. You've also got the lower end of the Northern Beaches that has performed exceptionally well, and you'll see this later in this video. In Melbourne, we're talking about the inner city. Now, in the inner city, I particularly mean the Yarra Council region has performed exceptionally well. The inner east, the inner south, and southeast. So we're talking about areas towards Albert Park, out towards Brighton, and areas around Surrey Hills, Box Hill, that kind of area. Old money areas, let's say. And you've got also your inner west of Melbourne. So it's your gentrifying regions, sort of close to Footscray, your Maribyrnong council regions, especially in Hobson's Bay, that kind of way. Some of those councils have performed just exceptionally well as well. For those who have cheaper budgets in mind, an actual area that's performed very well over the long term too, believe it or not, is actually Newcastle and Wollongong perform very well, and also Geelong and Melbourne. So look, you've got, suburbs of, under $1 million, right down to about $450,000 at the moment, that have actually performed literally more than 7% for more than 50 years, and I can trace that back quite well. But either way, let's go to some other locations too. Now, I'm not leaving out all locations in Australia here because that's just a little bit naive. But look, what I will say is there is some other parts of other cities. So look, the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast do have some very good regions. There's about 5 to 8 suburbs in both of them that I'd say are quite good areas to buy. The issue with those areas is the economy just isn't fundamentally backed by your fundamentally strong industries. Like a Gold Coast, for example, is backed a lot by tourism, not by medical, not by finance, banking, or anything like that. Look, Perth as well. Perth, you do have look, Perth, the interesting thing about Perth is it's so specific to the regions that you buy in, and you'll see that later in this video about exactly what I'm talking about there, because you've got quite a lot of land development that's happening in Perth, and it does, whilst it's not a mining town, a lot of the economy is backed by mining, and it does have issues there. So you want to be near areas where there are actually fundamentally strong industries, and I hate to say it, but you want to actually be near where all the jobs are. So that's just the truth of it. Hobart's also got a couple of suburbs now. Hobart's a little bit more of a difficult one to get data on, simply because Hobart, the data, especially from CoreLogic, it hasn't actually been there for as long as some other suburbs, but there is about 8 to 10 suburbs in Hobart that are worth buying, and you can buy right down there to, I'd say, around that $550,000, $600,000 mark, which is still worth buying in. Now, look, we're gonna start with just Sydney. Now, look, I grew up in Sydney. I love Sydney. It's probably my favorite place in the world, despite what a lot of people think about it. Look, Sydney, the biggest reason Sydney has grown so much is the fact that it's just geographically landlocked in every direction. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, you've got the Tasman Sea to the east, the Blue Mountains to the west, you've got the Royal National Park to the south, and Ku-ring-gai Chase to the north. Now, look, basically, in saying that, you've got no more real land to build. That's why there's so many apartments and so many cranes going up in Sydney, like nowhere else, basically, maybe even in the world, apart from probably Dubai. Now, you've only really got sort of your regions towards sort of Schofields and the ponds out towards the Hawkesbury, and kind of out sort of west of Canberra and southwest of Canberra towards Warragamba Dam and the Southern Highlands. Now, look, we're probably only 15 to 20 years away before that's completely built entirely out, especially after that airport's put in. It's just going to exacerbate with this, especially with this population growth, what's going on. It's just going to go crazy. And we're going to have no more land to build on. So you expect to see more apartments, especially with that recent density change by Mr. Chris Minns. Look, now, not only that, look, Sydney's got extremely low unemployment, and it's got also very high paid jobs, and most of these jobs are actually backed by fundamentally strong industries. So you've got large medical precincts in Sydney, you've got law precincts, you've got finance precincts, you've got construction regions, you've got tier one contractors almost everywhere. So that's what really backs the Sydney market. Then you've obviously got the real estate market, which I don't think needs any introduction. Not only that too, but Sydney is an international commodity. So you've got very high net worth individuals from nearly everywhere in the world coming to Sydney and wanting to buy in the best suburbs. So that pushes demand up. Probably misconception that not a lot of people don't know is that Sydney's actually got a lot of areas that have a very high base of cash buyers. So a lot of the suburbs, it's the same as Melbourne and Brisbane too. A lot of cash buyers are actually coming in to suburbs that are above $3 million. Not many people come into a suburb with, let's say, $3 or $4 million or above and actually get loans for it. Most of them are actually cash purchases, which is a misconception that a lot of people don't know. Anyway, another thing to do with Sydney is we are full of a lot of NIMBY councils. Now, look, you used to be able to get DAs through in three months or so. Now it's taking on average about 12 months. And not only that, but almost every development group in Australia doesn't. The development group, not only that, but sorry, not development group, but what I mean is more so your actual local doesn't want high-rise apartments in the backyard. And I hate to say, but I somewhat do agree with that. But it's the issue we've got is simply we have too many people. We don't actually promote zoning in the right areas, and then also we don't create enough homes in the areas that people want to live. So if we had lower migration, it'd probably actually help the cause. And we also, if we had better fundamental industry spread out, it'd probably help the cause too. But that's government, and I'm not getting into that. Anyway, let's go into a little bit of the actual further reasons why, and not further reasons, but actually why Sydney where's grown in Sydney. So you can see clearly here, here's your top 20 suburbs in Sydney. Now, look, something to learn here is that some of these suburbs were almost basically just going new estates or just fundamentally were blocks of land at the time that they were built. So an example of that is somewhere like Wattle Grove. It was very new when it was first built. Sydney is a very complicated market in saying that, like, because it's geographically unlocked in every direction, you do have suburbs everywhere, but there's definitely an eventuation if you look towards, especially the eastern suburbs like Bronte, Clovelly, and Bondi there, and also if you look towards places like Manly, Freshwater, and Pearl Curl, so the lower end of the northern beaches. Now, if you were to extend this map, you would see a lot of inner west suburbs, a lot of lower north shore suburbs, such as Neutral Bay. Another suburb that you'd see pop up would be Lewisham, Marrickville, suburbs like that. Now it is a little bit distorted, this one for Sydney, but you get the gist of it. And that's the growth that's occurred. So what you're going to see though is there's going to be a fight to quality where there's consistently low supply, and you'll notice as well, not only that too, but the high income demographics will pay more for properties, and especially because just simply the equity sitting in people's pockets. Now, let's go to Melbourne. It's probably, in my opinion, for capital growth alone, your best city in Australia to buy in. Now, the numbers paint a picture of that, and look, I'm going to go into the reasons first of why Melbourne has been the best capital growth market in Australia, and the reason being is because, again, like Sydney, you've got very good employment, very low unemployment rates. You've got high income jobs and very strong industry. So finance is a really big industry in Melbourne. I think 3 of the big 4 banks from memory have their ASX headquarters actually stationed there. And anyway, they're not ASX headquarters, but they're actual company headquarters, should I say. Melbourne's actually got the strongest population growth in Australia of any city. And you've got very strong international demand too, like Sydney too, especially in the really good school zones. Now, Melbourne again is home to very strong NIMBY councils. Places like St Kilda, Stonington's a good example. You get a lot of objection groups there, very hard to build, very hard to subdivide, so you don't have any more stock. You have very wealthy people wanting to buy in these areas, so therefore prices go up. Look, I'll go straight in to the actual numbers behind Melbourne. Now, the numbers, look, what the numbers say is basically you've got, you got a few areas that really continuously show up here. So an area that you can see that shows up a lot is the inner west of Melbourne, particularly in around Maribyrnong. Now, the reason is because it's gentrified a lot. Now, well, previously, areas like Footscray and Yarraville were probably considered the Bronx, especially in the 90s and before that. If you look at the history of places like the places where the Western Bulldogs played, especially, they were basically the working class man's AFL side in Melbourne. So that's one area. You'll see a lot of suburbs too towards the eastern suburbs and also towards the inner city and Bayside. So McKinnon's one, for example, Ashburn, Box Hill, that's another. They're in sort of southeast eastern suburbs, and Cremorne and Fairfield are in your sort of inner city market. So that's your areas in Melbourne that you would have loved to have bought years ago. As you can see, you could have bought in 1993, right down to, let's say, your $90,000, $100,000 mark quite easily. No problems there. You could probably even bought one of your better properties for your low $100,000 mark. Now, as I've previously discussed, Townsville was the same price at that point in time, and now it's $400,000. Most of these suburbs are towards your $1 million mark. So I don't make the same mistake. Listen to people who actually know what they're talking about. It's as simple as that. Now, let's just go to another city that I really like, and that city's Brisbane. Now, Brisbane it's very different to probably Sydney and Melbourne. Sydney and Melbourne, you do have pockets sort of all around the city. Like, for example, you wouldn't have seen it you won't see it in all the charts, but the places that are out of the cities, like Beaumaris in Melbourne, has very good growth. So there's some great schools around. It's a beautiful area, especially towards Blackrock and the actual point of Beaumaris there. And you got very good capital growth there. Brisbane's a little bit different in the sense of almost all of Brisbane's wealth is centred around the CBD. Now, it's about 10 k's either side of the CBD, north or south. You do have smaller pockets like Fig Tree Pocket and Chandler, that kind of area that have a little bit of wealth, but it's almost entirely centred around the CBD in Brisbane. And you'll see that in the actual growth in these suburbs. Now, look, Brisbane as well has had some really strong population growth, particularly among wealthy southerners. Now, a lot of these guys actually purchase outright in these suburbs, and I'm sure most of the Brisbane agents that are watching this would 100% be able to testify to this. And I've seen it physically even at auctions, people just signing forms and writing checks of paying for prices completely outright. But anyway, look, most of the white collar jobs in Brisbane sit around here too. So look, you got a lot of employment precincts that are around here. Good example of that's the CBD, Fortitude Valley's another, Cannon Hill's another, South Bank, the Woolloongabba district's also another one where you do have a fair few jobs. You also have some towards Milton down that way, but probably not as many. But that's basically all around your CBD, like I was saying. Now, here's your Brisbane's best performing suburbs over basically the last 25 years. Now, again, this is right down to 2018, and I like that because it shows you what's performed well without throwing a dartboard at Australia where everything's gone up by 30%. So you'll see the inner north of Brisbane and the inner east, which are my two favourite markets to buy in Brisbane. Now, if you look, for example, Bulimba's one, Camp Hill's another, Norman Park, Balmoral, Cannon Hill. Those are all in the inner east of Brisbane, and all areas that have really improved in income demographics over the course of time. So look, good example of that is Grange and Camp Hill have basically $3,000 a week net family household income. So that's basically on par with somewhere like the North Shore of Sydney. So, with prices of, $1 million at the time, that's just incredible. And that's why they've grown so much in value. Other areas, such as Hamilton, that's a good example. New Farm's another one. Hendra, Wilston, Windsor, those are really good examples of other suburbs. That's your inner north of Brisbane. Now, that's kind of a lot of those suburbs, especially Hamilton and Hendra, kind of your old money suburbs. So for people that don't know Brisbane, I'd compare it to somewhere like probably, lower North Shore, like your sort of Mossman, Cremornes, and for people in Melbourne, kind of like your inner east. So probably similar like your Hawthorns, your Camberwells, Surrey Hills, Canterbury, those sorts of areas. And yeah, they performed exceptionally well. Again, the reason being is because most of these suburbs are above $2,000 a week median weekly family household incomes, and the eventuation is quality before quantity, and it's just a flight to quality in these areas. So that's the reason. Another suburb I will point out, and it's not in those two areas, but look, you can probably argue it's a little bit of a part of it is probably Ashgrove. Ashgrove has very high median income, beautiful large blocks, only about 5 or so k's from the CBD, home to some very good schools, and it's a lovely just green area. So that's definitely another area to look at for Brisbane. I probably want to go to some of the smaller suburbs, or not suburbs, sorry, but cities in Australia. And the first one I want to probably go to is sort of the Hunter region, so that's Newcastle. And the reason for that is you've actually got exceptional capital growth in this area. So your top 20 suburbs here have actually performed at 8% or more. Now, if you look here, that's actually there's actually a few more, and this is only rounding out to the top 20, but there's about 25 suburbs that performed at about 8% or more, which is exceptional. Now, it looks higher than Brisbane, but the reason being for that, Brisbane performs very similar to it is just simply because, now I'll show you the Brisbane graph, it's just simply because if you look here, all that really has happened here is at the time, Newcastle had actually performed very well and Brisbane had gone through a low slow period. So that's just why it shows up like this. Now, let's go a little bit further into it. Now, if you look at all the Newcastle suburbs here, you'll see that there's an eventuation towards particular areas. Now, Merewether, Carrington, Tighes Hill, Maryville, Islington, Mayfield East, and Cooks Hill are all there. Now, if you look at a map of Newcastle, they're all in the same area. So they're all sort of in your, I would call it your sort of beaches suburbs and sort of your inner west by the harbour side suburbs. Now, the reason being, again, is because your beachside suburbs are historically old money suburbs, and your inner west, especially harborside suburbs, were previously very dirty kind of, miners' cottages. A lot of your wharfies used to work there years and years ago, especially in the 90s and before that. But now you've got a lot of your professionals that work there. So you've got suburbs like, for example, Tighes Hill that have a median family weekly household income of above $2,000 a week. So that's comparable to some inner west suburbs of Sydney, which is just insane. So that's why it's had so much growth, and it will continue into the future. Now, for those that haven't actually been to Newcastle in recent years, what I would say is just take a walk down Honeysuckle, the Wickham foreshore, take a walk along the Carrington harbour side and the Maryville harbour side, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. There's just high rises going up everywhere. There's beautiful blocks being maintained. There's not only maintained, but actually redeveloped in all the circumstances. You're getting people that have bought old places for $600,000 and stuff like that a couple of years ago that are now redeveloping a house and selling it for $2 million. So it's just incredible what's going on there. But yeah, if you're looking in Newcastle, this is probably your area to look. Again, prices now, I'd say in a lot of these suburbs since COVID are probably anywhere from about that sort of $750,000 mark right up to $2 million. So if you don't have that budget, I would probably look elsewhere because you're just going to subpar suburbs. So anyway, that's my summary of your sort of Newcastle market. Let's now go to another market in New South Wales, which I do really like, and that's Illawarra. And it doesn't particularly mean Illawarra. It's actually Newcastle. Not sorry, Newcastle. Sorry. I'll start again. It's actually the market I like here is actually the Illawarra, and by that I particularly mean Wollongong. Now, what I mean by that is it's certain suburbs in Wollongong have performed very well. Now, look, there's a general concentration of the Wollongong suburbs if you look here, and it probably goes back to the supply and demand again. Now, for those who aren't from Wollongong, basically Wollongong is, especially north of Wollongong, there's a thing called the escarpment. So it's basically like a really high hill basically at the back of Wollongong that basically not borders, but it basically overshadows all Wollongong. Now, you can't build on it just simply because it's so steep. So all the land there has already been built and there's no more land to be subdivided. So there's just no more supply. Now, if you look at the suburbs that have performed best here, you'll see all the Wollongong suburbs: Coaldale, Tarrawanna, Thirroul, Bulli, Stanwell Park, and Austin Mere. Now, they're all northern Wollongong suburbs, and they also all have the best long-term fundamentals in terms of very high wealth and demographics there, very low supply, a lot of professional jobs coming in those areas too. And not only that as well, but you've also got, I'd argue, some of the best school districts in that area. So a good example of that is close to Fairy Meadows, a good suburb. So Fairy Meadows got the university nearby, some very good public schools, some very good high schools. And it's not far from Illawarra Grammar School either. So that's a reason why, a place like Fairymeadow or a neighbouring suburb like Tarrawanna has done very well. Thirroul's another one. Thirroul now has, I think I read in the Illawarra Mercury when I went to Wollongong Uni about 6 or 7 years ago. I actually read that there's now 29 or something coffee shops, where might even be more now, in Thirroul. So great town centre. There's actually some fairly good white collar industry actually there in the town centre too, particularly off Lawrence Hargrave Drive there. So that's another area to look around. And you can see in here, Austinmere is a neighbouring suburb of Thirroul. So that's another one. Bulli is also a neighbouring suburb of Thirroul. So there's your eventuation towards the best suburbs. To give everyone an idea, you probably need to get into Wollongong's best suburbs now, probably somewhere around that, I'd say $950,000 mark, right up to about $2 million. So if you don't have that budget, do not buy in Wollongong, because you're buying a subpar asset. Anyway, on to the next. Finally, look, an area I do really like as well, and it's probably a cheapest market actually in the country, is your Barwon region. So your Barwon regions, now I don't necessarily mean your Surf Coast, your Queenscliff, so that's more like, your Lawns, your, Aireys Inlet, those sorts of areas, your Torquay. I mean more your Geelong area. Now, if you look here, now, this again, you'll notice there's not as many suburbs. You can see it's mostly centered around the Geelong CBD. Now, the issue here is that some of these suburbs, now they might only look to grow at 7% or even 6.5%, but there's actually like areas of those suburbs that have performed greater. Now, if you're saying a suburb has, average growth of 6.5%, you're naturally going to have pockets of the suburb that perform at 8% and some pockets that then perform at 5%. Now, you want to be buying pockets that perform at 8%. There's actually suburbs still in Geelong that you can buy for around close to $450,000 to $500,000 if you're lucky enough. So really good for someone with a little bit of a lower budget, especially longer term. Now, anyway, let's get on to it. So if you look around here, especially around the Geelong CBD, if you just look at how much houses have grown, that's just incredible. You can see East Geelong, Manifold Heights, Newtown, Geelong, Geelong West. Now, it's all around the CBD, and if you look in towards Geelong, the reason for that, again, is simply because you've got all the wealth basically stored in these suburbs. So basically, these suburbs are also the oldest. They're all built out. There's no more land to build. The best schools are all there, and all the best infrastructures. And now, if you go around, especially the Geelong foreshore, it's beautiful. You'd almost think you'd be somewhere like maybe even comparable to somewhere like probably Port Melbourne, maybe Williamstown. It looks quite similar. It's quite nice. It's close to the Surf Coast, so if you're a beach lover, it's a great area to live too. So good on Geelong. And also, I'd say, fundamentally, the industry is really improving. You've got tech firms coming in, you've got, finance firms coming in, legal firms, you've got medical precinct of Geelong too. So look, that's the backbone of the whole, economy there now. And you've got the nearby agriculture out towards Colac and West too. So yeah, that's an area that I think, if you've got a lower budget, particularly around that $500,000 mark, is somewhere I'd be looking as well. Look, let's not leave Perth out, because I don't want to leave it out. It's not probably my favourite area to buy in, but I do own out there. And look, the thing about Perth is that, you've got to be really careful about where you're buying in. Now, reason being is because Perth isn't a mining town at all. Now, I'm not insinuating that it is, but a large percentage of the actual GDP and the actual wealth coming into Perth is dependent on mining. Now, it is quite a volatile industry. So Perth does perform well over the long term, but it's very particular pockets that I would recommend buying, just simply because, like, areas of Perth, look, they're really good in performance, but then you've got others that are also very bad, and they also hold very high vacancy rates. Now, if you look towards here, you'll see a particular council region, and I'll give this away just for the sake of it. And one of them is a council region called Joondalup. Now, Joondalup, you can see a couple of suburbs. So an example is Hillary's, Connolly's another one. You've got Ocean Reef too, Joondalup itself, Kinross as well, and a few more actually in there. If you want to go right down to 8%, you'd have even more there too from Joondalup. Now, for those who aren't from Perth or have never bought in Perth or been there, the easiest way I can probably describe Joondalup to people that aren't basically locals or know the area well is Joondalup is basically the Parramatta of Perth. That's the easiest way to describe it. Now, the reason being is because people that live in the sort of northern coastal region of Perth, they don't consider going into town as going into the CBD. They mean into Joondalup. Now, Joondalup actually has a lot of your white collar jobs. The CBD does too, don't get me wrong. It's got white collar jobs, and it's also got, you know, fundamentally strong government industry backdrop. So a lot of the government admin jobs are actually in Joondalup. You've also got a few law firms. You've also got a few finance firms, larger real estate agencies as well that are there. So basically, look, you've got a few industries that are quite, you know, I'd say strong there. And not only that too, but it's also just the fact that when things go wrong in Perth, you do have long periods of, you know, I'd say limited price growth. Not only that too, but if you've got limited price growth in Perth, you probably want an area where you've got tenants in there for quite a long term. And even if you're an owner occupier or it's just your retirement home, you want to be in a suburb really where, you know, there's just stuff going on and there's, you know, services nearby and all that kind of thing. So, you know, what you'll see is that in times when the market goes down, you'll have suburbs in Perth that genuinely average 8 to 10% vacancy rates, sometimes even more. Joondalup will probably only average, and Perth is a more volatile market, somewhere around that 4% mark, which in retrospect is, in my view, still a little bit high. But for Perth, if you're buying at a very good time, that is quite good, and especially on into the future as this market continually is undersupplied, just simply because people have to live where their jobs are. And it's very simple. You've got easy access to the city and some of the nicest beaches. So, you know, Joondalup's only probably about a 10 to 15-minute drive from Ocean Reef, the beach down there. And if you like surfing or you like sort of other areas like the inner city and the walkable areas, so, you know, Tree Beach is probably only, I'd say, about 20 or so, maybe 25 minutes away to CBD, and Cottesloe are probably half an hour to 35 minutes or so away. So it's a pretty nice area. You're probably looking at a minimum price for that kind of area now, let's say somewhere about the $750,000 to $1.1 million price mark. Look, funny enough, in Perth as well, as I record this video, a lot of your cheaper suburbs in Perth have performed, you know, very well. I mean, above 50%, and some of your areas in Joondalup have only actually done around, I'd say 20 to about 40%. However, what's going to happen, I think, in the market is you'll find that the more fundamentally strong suburbs in terms of demographics will close out the actual Perth cycle significantly stronger. So it's an area, lucky to everyone who's watching this video, that I would very strongly recommend people buying if Perth is on your cards. Anyway, look, to finalize this video, what I want to do here is I simply just want to show people that, look, if there is a strong eventuation, or not eventuation, but performance towards Sydney and Melbourne areas, and they are the top performing suburbs in the market. Now, this report here is actually different to what I was showing everyone before, but it is the stats all come from CoreLogic, which is basically the best provider of, say, property data in Australia. And you'll see the best, these are SA3 areas, so these are council regions in Australia. So you can see Yarra, Melbourne City, Boroondara, and Maribyrnong, all areas that I was basically spitting out suburbs earlier. You can see the eastern suburbs there, two in Sydney. You can also see Marrickville, Sydenham Petersham, that's the inner west. Eastern suburbs and north, that's sort of your lower North Shore and upper eastern suburbs, all there, all really good areas to buy too. You can see your inner east and inner Brisbane. So again, really good, fundamentally strong areas in terms of demographics. So look, I highly recommend those areas to buy. Really good, and this is just going to continue on into the future. Now, unfortunately, again, like I said, the price to entry is quite expensive in these suburbs. So if you do have a budget of under $1 million, I would probably recommend looking places like Newcastle, Geelong, even some parts of the Central Coast are good as well, but very few suburbs. The Central Coast is actually considered a part of Sydney in both of these reports in terms of the city. So that's right up to sort of your Doyleson sort of boundary line if you draw a line out to the Tasman Sea there. And parts of the Blue Mountains also are considered in that. So there is actual suburbs in Sydney that have done very well. You'll notice in the Aussie Home Loans 25-year report, Glenning Valley is actually in there, and that's actually in the Central Coast, just inland from kind of your Terrigal. It's kind of in between your Terrigal and sort of Wyong area, Wyong Tuggerah area. So that's an area to consider. Another area is Geelong and also some parts of Perth. But in Perth, just be very careful because different parts of the market perform very differently, and some areas are just so volatile it's not even funny. Look, finally, reasons why Sydney and Melbourne perform so well, very simple. This is the ASX 50, and if you look at the headquarters of companies, look how dominated Sydney and Melbourne are. They dominate more than 50% of this entire list. So if you've got headquarters of the company and they're on the ASX 50, I'm telling you right now, they probably employ more than 2,000 people, maybe even more, or maybe something around that. And it means there's a lot of jobs, especially high income, white collar jobs, especially in management, director level jobs. So that does help basically your income demographics there. You'll see some Perth areas too, mostly you'll see that it's energy based, mining materials, one or two in Brisbane, not too bad. But yeah, that's generally what you'll see there. So that also underpins our market. But anyway, that's basically your top performing suburbs, and as to why they are your top performing suburbs. Now, let's go into my final, well, not my final, but my second last section of my video. Just one moment. Now, what that is the housing crisis in Australia. Now, this is just ridiculous. Now, look, however you sit politically is okay. And I don't mean to run a political, channel or anything like that here. This is purely property investment, property buying, if it's a house you want to live in or your best place to retire, anything like that. Now, what I'd say is this housing crisis is just going to continually get worse. Now, politics aside, really neither of the major parties or any of the major parties really in Australia knows how to resolve it. And all they try to do is they try to fix it, but they end up deepening it. Now, look, fundamentally, I think the reason for this is because victimhood in our current society has become actually a currency. Now, what happens is basically you got people like the Greens and Labor especially who think, the average investor is an evil capitalist who just wants to make money off, renting a house out to other people. And it's just not the truth. And continually over the course of the last couple of years, and mind you, it's not only Labor and the Greens, Liberal parties probably know better at that. They further disincentivize property investing. And what that has done is it's just further deepened the crisis. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. Now, let's go into some more detail with that. But anyway, first things first, one of the major reasons is this poor fiscal policy. Now, look, I've got a couple of things here that I'd like to show you. But first things first, here's an example. In 2015, APRA came out, and basically what they did was they put further buffers on investors, especially against defaults. Now, don't get me wrong, we do have a AAA, I think, rated credit system from memory worldwide, which is excellent. But, the emphasis of taking care of yourself, in my opinion, should be on the individual, not basically the government. Now, if the government obviously wants someone to, buy a rental property, add to the rental pool, that's great. But what all they're doing here is simply, creating worse and worse and worse incentives for people to get in, and it's actually making lending harder. Now, all this did was actually make, stock go down and more people flee out of the market, which, is just bad. And it's actually bad for our country in general. Here's another one. In 2017, after the Royal Commission, basically what they did was they further tightened residential lending, especially on investors again, because they thought it was too risky. Now, you had some banks come out and, to be honest, do the wrong thing 100%, but further tightening the market was even more stupid. And now, look, both of these came in the midst of the boom for both Sydney and Melbourne. So between 2014 and 2017, Sydney and Melbourne did exceptionally well. And what happened there really was that APRA came out, and the government especially came out with both rhetoric and also policy here that targeted in especially investors, despite Sydney and Melbourne not being the entire part of Australia. So it kind of killed the whole market, just especially in 2017, where you had places like Brisbane and Perth that really needed just places for people to rent. But anyway, the government does what they do, and yeah, that's some of the reasons. Further reasons: increased stamp duty. Over time, you can see in the 90s here that stamp duty was around, only a month or so's worth of income. So now, especially Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, you can see here, you're looking at probably minimum 5 to 6 times your income, which is just ridiculous. And government likes to do things like this. I think from memory, I think it's their highest revenue stream out of anything, to be honest. But anyway, increasing in stamp duty is only going to make deposits harder for people. And you don't need any numbers, or you can look at the numbers, but it's very common sense. But anyway, there you go. Further reasons. Now, I hate to say this, and I do feel really sorry for Victorians, but increased land tax, not only in Victoria, it's also other states too. And it's not necessarily that they're changing the rate that land tax is valued at, but it's what's happening is they're purposely valuing land tax at significantly more than what it should be worth. So you might have, for example, property values have gone up in between the years of, let's say, 2020 and 2022 in places of Brisbane, and it might have gone up, let's say, 30%, but they're increasing your land value by 50 or more percent. Now, I don't know how they can actually justify that, but somehow they are. And yeah, it's just causing people to pay more and more money to the government, which is then therefore pushing people away from actually investing in the market. So anyway, another one here is, and I feel really sorry for Victorians, because that Dan Andrews government, I'm not necessarily putting down consistently the Labor Party or boosting up the Liberal Party, but some of these policies that are brought out like this, increasing the land tax because of your actual fuck up in the start of it, that is your fault, and you should not tax people more because of that. What you should be doing is creating a more sustainable economy and actually creating an economy that is more efficient and therefore is more profitable and makes more money, because it is your fault, not the people. Now, anyway, but what they decided to do is increase land tax. Now, what that's done is it's not actually only residential land tax, it's actually commercial too, which is even more stupid, because what you're then going to do is you're going to make actual businesses be able to employ less people, and some maybe even shut down. If you've got your small to medium enterprise there that wants to run and can't afford, let's say, 4% or increase in land tax because they're running at 2% margins, you're just getting rid of people that would have jobs and then are probably going to have to go on a welfare or really struggle to pay either their rent or mortgages, and it just creates more stress. It's just ridiculous. And furthermore, what's happened here is investors have then also just been sick of all these punches in the face, and they've just abandoned the market. So that's another reason. Furthermore, let's go to another one. And look, I find this absolutely ridiculous, because if what I've shown you isn't enough, how can someone who is publicly elected decide on policies like this when it is so simple? This is all publicly available information here. All of it you can find online. I don't have a back channel, or not in bed with any of the political parties or anything like that. But they could find this online in next to half an hour, all of this information, but they still do this. But anyway, increased rental legislation, that's another one. So rules against rent bidding, that's one. I know, for example, too, like another thing that they're looking to do as well is make absolute maximum caps on the amount that rent can go up in a year. Now, all that's doing is really that what it is I understand the idea against rent bidding because, look, you don't want, for example, areas where, like, students from very wealthy backgrounds just come in and pay, a couple $100 above market. Now, I have a really good friend, and I feel sorry for people like this, who is from the Riverina region, and he, has to rent in Sydney because he can't afford to buy. He doesn't have any. Wasn't given any handouts, and people don't understand this. But renting in your fundamentally good areas is very expensive, and I think they previously rented for something around $700 a week. But then since COVID, it's gone up to, I think, more than $1,100 a week, and now. This is a 3-bedroom unit in Ashfield. It's not even like your Cremornes, your, McMahon's Point. It's not your Point Piper or anywhere like that. How is the average person supposed to afford that? Now, I know it probably sounds like I'm arguing for increased rental legislation, but I'm actually not. I'm saying that rental bidding, what it is it's a supply problem. So if you had, for example, 100 people looking for a home and only, let's say, not only, but let's say in a fairer market, let's say 70 homes available or something like that, homes are probably going to go for naturally good, I'd say fair prices. So naturally, prices won't rise as much. But if you've got people being disincentivized by things like this that are fundamentally out of the control of the landlord, all they're going to do is just abandon it and then either invest in a business or invest in the stock market. They might put their money in a Vanguard fund or a managed fund or something like that. And then furthermore, it's bought by an owner-occupier and then you have less stock in the market. But anyway, I guess it helps some of these political parties, get some votes, which is by the screaming minority. But anyway, is what it is. Anyway, let's go on to the next one. Now what we do is, especially in the media, and I hate to say it, but the media is full of just unqualified people. Look at what's happened really since COVID. I remember media outlets coming out saying property would fall by 30 and 40%, but it increased in the same year by 30%. So they're 60 or 70% wrong? How do you still have a job if you're 60 or 70% wrong? Like, you have a title of being an actual journalist to get that right, but you're getting it that wrong. And now what they furthermore do is they then demonize the investors. And I hate to say it, but the actual investor, you're actually solving a national crisis. You're actually going out and you were, creating stock for someone to live in. You're putting shelter over someone's head. So you actually, in my eyes, should be incentivized to do that because the government can't provide all of that. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But anyway, look, close to 72% of Australians only own one investment property, and the average actual investor, believe it or not, is just a median income earner, often a mum and dad. So what, are you going to put a mum and dad who's been working for 30 years just to afford the property to invest in their future and not be on, for example, Centrelink, not to be on, welfare or anything like that? Are you going to say, you've done the wrong thing, let's tax you more for doing the right thing? All you're doing is disincentivizing an actual goal set, an aspirational person who's taken actual money out of their own funds to not make you pay for things in the future. But you want to disincentivize them, and the media does the exact same thing and demonizes them. So that is, in my view, that's absolutely pathetic, and that needs to stop. And any media outlet that wants to do that should be shut down immediately. Maybe not shut down immediately, but all the viewers should really just stop watching it because it's just giving attention to unqualified people. But anyway, they need their attention too. But anyway, on to your next thing. Let's give you some statistics just purely on what's actually true about the market, okay? So despite the noise, 30% of dwellings in Australia have been rented. Now that's for over 70 years. So that's actually since literally the 1950s. Now, these include all families, singles, students, and also professionals. Now, what the media likes to say is it's greedy landlords going behind everyone and just taking money off the family that doesn't have any money. Well, if that's true, does that also count for the doctor who's on a locum who might move, for example, out to somewhere like, let's say, Dubbo, because there's a shortage of doctors? Let's say out to Batlow, let's say out to Roma or Surat, let's say out to Shepparton. Does it include them? Does it include the farm workers who we so desperately require out in your rural communities. No, it doesn't. But it suits the rhetoric of these idiot political parties. So, you know, they go behind that. Now, also, the government only provides 8% of the total rental stock on market. Now, if you want to actually make it out that you do a lot for the country and you only own 8% of the total rental stock on market, but 92% is provided by the private market, I do not know why people listen to you, and I do not know why other people do not look at these things. Now, if you looked at these things, you would just literally ignore everything the government says, which you almost should do in this sphere, because they clearly don't know what they're talking about. It's as simple as that. Now, let's go to some more statistics just to show you how poor the government is at doing things like this. Now, in 1976, the government had 300,000 dwellings owned that were available for rent. So that includes your federal, state, and territory governments, right? Now, today, and that is literally 50 or so years later, it has the same number. Now, since 2015, believe it or not, there has been 3 million people come into Australia, and that's the population increase of Australia, 3 million people. Now, you would think that especially since 2015, and especially even worse since 1976, you would have an increase of rental properties. But here's your statistics. Now, look, this is actually so bad for the country. But anyway, let's go to them. Now, over this course of time, we had in 2015, with 3 million less people, 72,000 properties available for rent. Now, today, there are 30,000 properties available for rent. Now, if you don't believe me, let's just have a look at this at the next graph. Now, this is nationally. Now, if you look at this is your stock on market rental listings. Now, you can see before 2015, you had a fair bit of growth there. We also had population growing. So that's, you know, now these rental listings, again, are mostly provided, as I gave you the statistics, by the private market. Again, so 92% of the private market of rental listings are from the private market. Now, only, as I said, only 8% from the government, and that number stayed the same in total, in terms of total listings, since 1976. So it's the private market that's actually providing up to 2015. You can see it there, the total stock go basically stagnant. And then you can see, especially since COVID, with more idiotic policies, it go further down. Now, that's just crazy. Now the government could literally just go onto SQM and have a look at this and think, oh, I'm a bit quack, I don't know what I'm doing, and I stuffed up. And that's what they should do. But they need to win votes from people that don't look at anything. So good on them. But anyway, now, probably furthermore to this is, look, probably I've explained what the government's done wrong, but I probably need to explain what they need to do to get this right. And anyway, look, an easy way to describe this is probably vacancy rates. Now, vacancy rates are basically, it's basically the amount of people that are looking for properties on the market as to how many properties on the market are available. Now, what an even vacancy rate looks like is somewhere between 2.5% and 3%. Now, if you'd like to know what the average vacancy rate at the moment in Australia is, it's somewhere around that 1% mark. Now, 2% is undersupplied, 1% is critically undersupplied. So basically what that means is any property that comes to market is snapped up immediately. Now, that is a terribly bad thing for Australia. And look, if you want to know in terms of an even vacancy rate of between 2.5% and 3%, how many dwellings we would need available, the number would be in advance of 200,000 dwellings. Now, want to know something more? Now, we've got 30,000 dwellings on market. 30,000 dwellings on market for rent at the moment, and for it to be even, we need 200,000 dwellings. Remember that when you go to, especially for renting, or even if you actually genuinely care about Australia, remember that when you go to vote next time, because it truly is just it's a disaster. Now, To tell you how much of a disaster this is, no one is actually going to believe this next thing. And then what I'll say is, so look, most people would agree that, you know, housing in the United States is a massive homelessness problem. Now, you want to know what Australia's homeless numbers are? Here you go. Australia has a homelessness rate per capita of 2.5 times that of the United States. So if you see videos on the news, and that could be any news station, no matter how you sit politically, whatever you think, Australia on average has a 2.5 times percent, two and a half, it says 2.5% times more the vacancy, not the vacancy rate, sorry, the homelessness rate than that of the United States. That is insane. That is absolutely crazy. And if you want to actually go and find that, go and look under bridges in Brisbane. Go and look at the back of suburbs in parts of Perth. Go and look at out in the suburbs of Sydney and out in areas, for example, close to shelters under bridges. Look at that. And it's just a joke. It's crazy what is going on. And this is Australia. Like when I was a kid, I couldn't believe, like I remember, you know, the middle class being a really, you know, fundamentally strong thing. And like, you know, what's going on is just, it's disgusting, and the government really needs to do something about it. But anyway, as I discussed before, here's your national vacancy rate. As I said, it's around 1%. Again, look at what happened from 2015, stagnant, still undersupplied, but slightly undersupplied, but still stagnant. Look what happened since COVID. So, yeah, thank you, politicians, for that, and the government. Furthermore, let's have a look at the average household size. So you can see here that we had a fairly stagnant household size in Australia since sort of, you know, the 2008 sort of time, right through, I'd argue about sort of 2018, 2019. Then you had a bit of a drop before COVID, then it went back up simply because of the students leaving. Now, look what's happened since then. Now, if you've got, let's say, the same amount of households, so if you've got the same amount of households, right, or dwellings, should I say, that are available, but you've got less people in each household, naturally there needs to be more demand to cover these households. But in saying that, what's happened is we don't have any more households, but we need more households just simply on the average household size. So that adds furthermore to the actual issue. Now, let's go to some policies that the government has promised, but let's see if they'll actually deliver on them. Here we go. What about the million homes in 5 years plan? I think it might even be 1.2 million, but depending on the media source, you will see different numbers, but let's call it 1 million just to be safe. Now, they're already behind on this number, okay? So at the moment, the government said we're going to build in excess of 200,000 dwellings. Now, depending on the reports you look at, they're probably projected to do somewhere around 140,000 homes this year. So they're already behind by 60,000. But again, remember the number I said earlier, the dwellings we'd need for rent would be in excess of $200,000. So even if we're being conservative there, you would need $200,000 when we've got $30,000 of 30,000 homes available for rent. Now, that's 170,000 short. So you add, let's say they're already short of their, they're already short of their 200,000 dwellings, and they've only got 140,000 dwellings. That there alone is 60,000. Then again, you've got 170,000 dwellings already short. There you go, 230,000. Furthermore, builders are collapsing as well. So here's a recent report only a couple of days ago. Collier Homes collapses under liquidation. Crisis hits Aussie builders. Again, you want to tax people more. You want DAs to be longer. You want extended land tax. You want every red hoop there is in Australia. And commercial rates are expensive. It's not easy to be in the building industry. You know, your gross realisation values are so tight at the moment. You want to support these guys. Don't stop literally this idiotic socialism, tax people more, give it to people who don't try to contribute to the country. Policy is just stupid. Anyway, here we go. Next, let's just be honest here now. Okay, so we've got measures of success. So, what do people actually want to need? Now, 98% of dwellings that are purchased are actually existing dwellings. They're not new dwellings. Now, the issue with that is most of the existing dwellings, most of the demand goes into existing places where the jobs and infrastructure are. So regardless of if the government could actually say we're going to build 50 million homes, right? But the fact of the matter is if they're not in the locations where people want to live and where demand is, none of that matters. They could build 50 homes in remote WA in the Simpson Desert or the Gibson Desert. It's not the Simpson, sorry, the Gibson's in WA, right? But if no one wants to live there, they'll all stay vacant and the same demand will be there and the same shortage will be there in the exact locations where people want to live. Now, again, as I said earlier, new estates appeal to very few people. Now, because of that, no one wants to live there, especially educated people do not want to live there. Now, because of that, most of the new dwellings are in new estates, and simply speaking, the demand isn't there. Now, the measure that the government should be looking at isn't simply as well. So they've already run the NATIT circumstance, but what's happened here is they're saying we're going to build these dwellings, and building isn't necessarily an accurate measure. The accurate measure they need to look at is two very simple measures, and it's how many homes are available to rent and how many are available to be bought. And now, simply speaking, it is because if you've got an apartment block, let's say of 10, a small Art Deco apartment block has been built, and so 10 dwellings. If you have, for example, let's say, I don't know, all of them that have been built but they're not actually available to rent, it's not actually increasing the supply that then actually suffices some of that demand. That's the issue. So if you're saying we've built 140,000 dwellings, but none of them are stationed, none of them have the actual services that are needed to be there, none of them also have all the fixtures and fittings or been actually, should I say, passed by the actual building commission, then it doesn't even count to the thing either. So anyway, there we go. That's another thing that you probably want to know. I'll just share that screen so everyone can see the actual dot points that I was talking about. Anyway, furthermore, let's go to the next point. Councils, red tape, and NIMBYs. 1.3 million homes blamed on councils' NIMBY. So what this basically is a lot of people, a NIMBY is not in my backyard, that's what it means. There's a lot of councillors who are against this. There's also a lot of locals who are against this. Now, I hate to say this, but I am also probably, I'd say, a light NIMBY. I think near great transport infrastructure, you probably should have higher densities, no doubt. But I think also, you know, to create the, not create, but maintain the Australian way, I think having a backyard's a beautiful thing. And now, look, I grew up in a working class household, not a wealthy household at all, but a very standard, I think 400 or so meters squared family home. And, I loved it, playing in the backyard. It's the Australian way. It's the Australian dream. So I think what we need to do to suffice this is, along our transport infrastructure, we need to make sure that we have the right density. And we also not only have one, the parking, and two, not only that, but also the infrastructure, shops and services that are required for our actual Australians to live in. And not only that too, but we should also think about regional centres. Now, a lot of regional centres are actually, funny enough, probably not as NIMBY as some of the inner city council regions, in saying that a lot of them actually would really welcome some more services. Like, I've got family in the Northern Rivers, and I know a lot of them, whilst they don't want their complete farmlands, destroyed and that kind of thing, a lot of them would love for a good medical precinct. A lot of them would also love for, some really good shops, low-key shops in the area. A lot of them would love for maybe even some apartment blocks for the younger individuals who need to buy the market. There's just no stock available. But we really need to think of this and think about the future of our country, because if we don't, I really worry about Australia. And to be honest, it's becoming a really divisive topic, and it's really bad. But anyway, that's another thing. Now, look, if the government really wants to say that, or demonise investors more, and say that that's a true fact, I'll give you something here. Now, the fact that $50 billion today or more is spent on the aged pension proves that Australians don't take their future seriously. Now, What you need to do is you need to incentivize aspirational people who want to take care of their future, so we don't have this burden of social security that is put on Australia and therefore doesn't get reinvested into our economy. Now, if you don't do that, this number, and you can see this is literally 5 years ago or so, this number's continued to rise and it's actually got even worse, right? So again, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this is basically what's happened. Now, let's go further into this. Now, people used to live a lot shorter. Now, people are living longer and longer and longer. Now, this is since 1970. Now, look at what's happened. The average person in 1970 lived a touch over 70 years old, about 71 to 72 years of age. Now, the average person now is 83.3 years old in Australia. That was actually in 2021. It's probably even higher now. Now, what this isn't taking into consideration is the average Australian who's actually over 50 actually lives to around 93 to 95 years old. Now, you're not on the pension till you're over 60 years old anyway. So if you think about that, you're probably going to need somewhere around 30 years worth of either welfare, so that's government pension, or self-sufficiency to survive. Now, because we have an aging population, what's going to happen is we're going to continually need to fund more and more money into this fund, or not fund, but into our tax dollars into the pension and welfare because of this. Now, if the government really cared, what they would do is incentivize people to actually get into investing, so there's no requirement for an age pension and we can actually spend that money back into our economy. But anyway, again, as I said, I don't know if the government would ever actually value doing anything about it, because their decisions for most of the years I've been alive have been very poor. But anyway, next slide. Now I've got, look, not next slide, but I'll actually share some genuine thoughts on this actual topic. Now, look, in saying all of this, the government needs to know, and actual providers need to know, that's both state, territory, and federal, that investing is discretionary. It's not mandatory by law. If you're disincentivizing someone to do something, they're not going to invest. It's as simple as that. If you said to me, for example, if you walk down the road, which is 5 minutes away, instead of driving, you'll make $100, you'll probably walk down the road. If you say, for example, that I'll charge you, let's say $5 to walk down the road, but you could drive down the road, for example, then you're probably just going to drive, right? It's the same thing as saying, if the government said, please invest in your future and I will incentivize you to do so, people are probably going to invest in their future. But if you say, we're going to slap you with land tax, higher council rates, we're going to slap you with, higher stamp duty, then people are going to be less incentivized to do it. And that's just what's creating the crisis. Now, furthermore, look, in my view, it would take, if every correct decision was made by the government to fix this crisis, I think it would take somewhere between 3 and 4 years to fix. Now, that is absolutely crazy in my view. However, look, that's what's going to happen, and I hate to say it, but I really don't have any faith in anyone, especially in government, without radical change to do this. So it's just going to continually get worse. Now, what it's become a very divisive political topic. Now, the reason being is because you've got a whole generation that can't afford property unless they either have help, are basically an entrepreneur or very high up in an industry earning maybe $300,000, or they have family money that can help them out. Now, look, it's not a healthy thing for the country. It's actually shocking. And I, really worry about the future of Australia. Now, anyway, let's go on to what I actually genuinely think of this. Now, here we go. Immigration numbers. And now this is going to annoy probably a lot of people, but I think it's important to share it for everyone because, I just want it to be pure and honest and actually show people what's going on. So if you look here, this is the most recent release that I could find. The annual growth rate of people has been 659,800 in total, so that's 2.5%. And the migration numbers have been made up of close to 550,000. Now, do you think logically that that's a good idea for Australia to bring in, when we have such a bad housing crisis, this many people? I'm sure you can answer that question. The answer is an obvious no. Now, what do we do about this? Look, we have to stem immigration. We have to invest in people that are going to create dwellings to help this crisis. It's as simple as that. It's not rocket science. Now, even worse, we have other political people that get involved and do things like this and suggest things like this. So this is one of the members of Parliament. He's suggesting rent freezes, which, you know, as I've already described for quite a while, that's only going to exacerbate it. And I think he's even described from memory as well that he wants to put a very low cap on what a rent could be in the future too, which is just absolutely ridiculous in my view. Like, that's unbelievable. And, you know, my imagination is if that was to actually happen, you probably have average vacancy rate, in my view, maybe shrink from 1% to somewhere between 0.5 and maybe, let's call it 0.5, maybe 0.7%, between 0.5 and 0.7% probably would be the number if they put rent freezes in. So it's just ridiculous. And that then again would create less stock, put more pressure on the government to spend more money on welfare, which then means less money to investment, which then in the long run will actually make it a worse fundamental country in terms of its finances and also in terms of homelessness. That just go even out the door. We might even be 3 or 4 times that of the United States. But anyway, he needs to win votes, you know, out of the screaming minority, as a lot of these parties do. But anyway, there you go. Now, look, I know this sounded like quite, should I say, I wouldn't say disincentivizing, but what I'd say is maybe it sounds like a little bit, you know, bad. It might sound like I'm being a little bit negative to an extent, but I don't mean it that way. But there's actually some really positive things to this. Now, look, the most positive thing I can tell you out of this, and I'll go straight back into it, is that, look, it's a great time to be an investor because, look, you're actually helping a national emergency. And I'll tell you right now, if you were an investor, you are doing more than any government in Australia has done for probably, like, I'd say something along the lines of maybe 15 years or something like that. So if you want to know who actually does more for the housing in Australia, it's you if you become an investor. Now, not only that too, but you would be rewarded with both capital growth and rental growth for years to come. Now, I'm not doing this not saying that to take the piss out of people who rent or anything like that, or owners, but there's clearly a shortage. Australia has a great economy. We have the highest net worth per capita, aside from Singapore and the United Arab Emirates, of any major country in the world. So there's going to be a shortage for years to come, and excess demand from a very wealthy demographic. So you're very lucky to live here, and if you have the opportunity to get in, simply just get in. That's with my advice. Now, finally, look, aspirational people receive aspirational results in life. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, look, through freedom, people feel very rewarded. Now, what I mean by that is if things go wrong in your life, that's probably the first thing I'll start with. You can get out of situations. Now, hypothetically, let's say, for example, you own a property to live in, and you might own one investment, for example. Now, you might have an elderly mother who unfortunately gets kicked out of her property that she's been living in for so long, and will be out on the street if she doesn't have somewhere to live. Now, if you invest in your future, you may even be able to help her in the future and let her stay in your property for a couple of months until she finds that property she needs, just to get her back on her feet. Now, that's a very sort of, I'd say, emotional and very sort of charismatic, I'd say, thing to do, but it's something that you genuinely do it and help a family member or something like that. Another thing that but another aspirational thing that someone might receive is that, look, in the future, you might have a family and you might have, let's say kids, and let's say you have one kid, and, you know, the average income to get into the property market might be, I don't know, let's call it $300,000, which probably might even be realistic in the future with the way things are going. It might be $200,000. Now, if you could help that person out, or that your child out, you would feel so rewarded by that, it's not even funny, right? Even so, you might even for example, sell down one of your investments and live off just the income for life. Therefore, you wouldn't be too reliant on the pension. You might, not only that too, you would be actually giving the government more money to spend in the right areas. Now, that's something that people should look at. Now, whether they do or not, it's probably up to them. But if you really want to do something with your life, the opportunity is just there to go and take it. So that's the biggest thing that I'm striving for people to do here. But anyway, look, I do hope that everyone understands that it is a great time to be an investor, and it's actually a great time to help a national emergency in our housing crisis. Now, please, if you can do to help the crisis, and secondly, if you don't and the governments continue to actually do what they're doing, and this is actually a word to the governments, if any of them actually see this, you are actually creating even more social unrest than anything I can think of in the country. Now, I've thought about this so much, and I don't even know if this may happen, but I think that if this continued to happen, it could create something along the lines of a divide, almost like a civil war. Now I don't mean to insinuate anything by that, but what I mean is it's actually becoming so divisive and politically motivated that genuinely the government needs to step in and they need to actually do something about it. And with 92% of dwellings coming from individuals, it's actually not up to the government, it's up to us to change this. Now, hopefully the government can understand this and actually incentivize people to help the situation. So anyway, that's my view on it. And look, I hope people are happy to help out and the government is too. Cheers. On to the final section. Just give me 1 second. Now, the final section, it's probably my shortest of the lot. And what it is that basically, look, it's a great time to be an investor now, as I said previously. But what I'm more talking about here is, look, final section really is the fact that purchasing the right asset is the most important. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, very simply, Warren Buffett's got a quote. Now, what his quote is that he says it is far better to buy a wonderful company at a fair price than a fair company at a wonderful price. Now, property is no different to that at all. I can promise you, throughout all my experience, it is exactly the same. Now, what do I mean by this? Now, I'll go straight into it and cut to the chase. What I mean by this is the fact that look, markets generally over the long term look, I did finance in uni, and now, look, not that I think a uni degree means anything, but this is something that is true. There's a thing called efficient market hypothesis, and what that basically says is markets are generally efficient over the long term. They revert to their averages. Now, here's an example of both Sydney and Brisbane. Now, this is out of CoreLogic. Now, you can see periods where Sydney's done great and Brisbane have done great, and you can see periods where it's done almost next to nothing. Now, here's a good example of it. Now, between the years of 2002, between the years of 2002 and 2010, Sydney did almost next to nothing, to be fair. However, Brisbane in those years almost doubled, right? However, between the years of, let's say, 2012 and 2017, Sydney almost doubled and Brisbane did next to nothing. However, over the long term, you can see that they do catch up with their long-term averages. Probably another thing to pick up in this graph is just don't buy units. Please don't buy units. Like, unless you want to lose money and lose opportunity costs in the long term, feel free to buy a unit. But yeah, don't buy units. That's a bad idea. Anyway, let's go to the next point I want to make. Now, the key point I want to make here is, look, why the asset is more important than timing is because greater assets always outperform poor assets, right? Now, assets that grow in capital also grow in rent if located correctly over time. Now, the reason you want this is because, simply speaking, yield is a representation of the asset value. Hence, you want the asset value to increase over time. Now, I've previously mentioned this. However, I should mention this again. What happens over time is capital growth in your best suburbs will probably do somewhere between 7 and 10% in the long term. rental growth will do somewhere between 3 and 4%. So what happens is you've got rental growth going like, not rental growth, sorry, you've got capital growth going like this and rental growth going like that over time. Now, because of that, you've got a light inverse relationship. So yield will slide down over time, but you're getting a greater cash flow, and you've also got good equity in there over the course of time. So a good example of this is something like, I'll give an example, and look, Sydney siders will understand this very well. Somewhere like Ashfield in Sydney, about 10 years ago or so, was around, I'd say, you probably $1 million mark or so. And you probably would have got, call it, probably 3.2% yield at the time. So that's 32,000 a week, not 32,000 a year in rent. Now, what's happened there is now it's about $2 million and you're probably getting about 2.4% in yield or so, something like that. So you're getting $48,000 now in rent. You paid yesterday's price and you've got in excess of cash flow, roughly $16,000. So that's incredible, and that's how people make wealth. So your loan balance, if you bought it 80%, $800,000 might be somewhere in the late fives or $600,000 mark. So you have so much equity to be serviceable, because if you could pay that yesterday with those rates, you could definitely buy it today. And probably more, because you would have paid down some loan and you would have got growth. And you can go again, and that really changes your life. So that's the reason. And really what it is dollar cost averaging will outperform the market in the long term, will outperform in the long term. Dollar cost averaging in the long term will outperform in the market rather than simply trying to time it. Now, what I mean by that is you might buy literally the best suburb, of all of, not the best suburb, but let's say the best growth suburb or hotspot, should I say, in all of Australia that grows 20 to 40% in 2 to 3 years, which is awesome. However, if it does nothing for the next 15, you're going to lose money to all the better suburbs, and that's what continually happens. Now, because you're going to get other buyers agents and people that call themselves experts online that will say, no, that's not true. I bought for this amount of money, and I made this. All right, let's go to a real example. Okay, now the case study I'm going to give you is Logan region, in the actual Logan region. So I think the postcode I used was 4131 in Queensland, and a suburb, and not the suburb, but a postcode called 2304, which is Mayfield and Mayfield East in Newcastle. Now, in 2008, we had the GFC. Now, this bottomed out around in 2009 in most markets. Now, some in 2008, but I've just used 2009 because it's a really good example of what basically happened in there. Now, over the long term, Logan has averaged somewhere between, generally, most of the suburbs, 4 and 5%. Mayfield has averaged somewhere between 7 and 9%, right? Now, in this crash, I'm good friends with a few of the agents in Brisbane, and I had really good friends, and I used to actually manage them in my sales team, who used to sell around Aspley, Stafford, Kendron, Wavell Heights, to the north of Brisbane, right? And I asked him, this was a few years ago, what happened in the downturn of the market in Brisbane? And he said, your fundamentally good markets, such as your inner north and inner east of Brisbane, dropped by about 10%. However, areas like, your Logans, your Cabooltures, your areas with very low income demographics fell by a lot further. Now, they fell in some instances by 30 to 40%. Now, the reason why this happened is because a lot of these people didn't have much money and didn't have much, should I say, equity in their properties. So what happened in the GFC was, because stocks got smashed, super balances absolutely got smashed as well. Therefore, people had less and less money to then be able to actually retire, and especially people over the age of 50 at the time almost had to sell because they had no choice. Now, look, it was a bad decision 100% to sell it, but if you had to, you had to. And because people didn't have money, people had to sell there. It's as simple as that. Now, because there were so many people selling, because it's an area with higher LVRs, what happened is more come onto the market, and you had falls between 30 and 40% because of that. Now, what then happened was, because that happened, the market did not grow for a long time because it was so badly affected. And not only that too, but you actually found those people then had to actually move out further and further. So you had people moving to regional Queensland just to simply live because their super balances got smashed. Now that's so bad, but imagine people had actually bought correctly and what they could have done. Now, in that time, believe it or not, Mayfield and suburbs in Logan were actually very similarly priced. Now, that sounds almost unbelievable, right? However, it's actually a true fact. Now, Logan today is priced at $500,000 with roughly 5% yield. Mayfield is $850,000 with 4% yield. Like let me show you the reason why you don't purchase somewhere like Logan, simply speaking, longer term. Now, again, if you're in the like timing the perfect part of the market and you've got a retirement plan of 4 to 5 years, fine, buy there. But if you've got a plan of 10 plus years, which in my eyes is the amount of time you should have to buy property, do not buy there at all. 100% do not buy there. Anyway, here's a graph. So your postcode of 4131, which includes a lot of the Logan suburbs, and I didn't pick the worst suburbs in Logan like Woodridge, I picked your sort of general suburbs of Logan. As I said, in 2010, roughly then, so just after GFC, you can see roughly $300,000. Now, what is it today? $550-ish thousand. Look, that might go to 600. There's a fair bit of demand in the Brisbane market and the cheaper suburbs, no doubt. I'm telling you what's going to happen there is it'll go to 600,000, then it'll do next to nothing for another long period. It might maybe another 15 years and all these people will be upset again. So anyway, that's what will happen. Now Mayfield, what happened? Look, prices, look, I'd call that a little bit probably over Logan. It might be about 330,000 or so, but relatively similar speaking, same time. Now prices today, let's call it 850 or so thousand. Now that's probably going to go up maybe towards the $900,000 mark as well. But you know, you've got, even in retrospect, if both go up by 50,000 or it stays the same today, you've got literally a difference of, you know, what, $300,000 in equity alone in just price growth. It's insane. Now let's make it even differentiate even more. Logan in 2010 rented for, let's call it somewhere between about $350 a week, maybe. Let's call it that, something around that kind of mark. And you can see today it rents for maybe $550 a week, which, yeah, that might increase a little bit more, maybe, probably not too much, because the demographics, you know, just won't be able to pay more than that. It's as simple as that. That'll plateau out. And you can see, you know, the rent didn't really increase for about 11 years, so, which is insane, considering, you know, inflation generally runs between, you know, somewhere, I'd say around the 3% mark, probably a bit low in that period, but still you're literally losing money just on inflation doing that. So it's absolutely insane. Mayfield, very similar rent originally. Again, Logan would have yielded a little bit more, slightly more than Mayfield at the time of buying. However, what happens here? Look, rents roughly, let's call it $350 to $380 a week there for Mayfield. Today, $650 a week in rent. Now, that's probably going to go to 700, and you can see the consistency of growth there, just how consistent that is and how much money the average person would have made over the course of time, paying down their loan and consistently creating more wealth. Now, not only that too, I'll tell you right now, the demographics between both of them are chalk and cheese. Now, what do I mean by that? Basically, you have a lot higher crime rate in somewhere like Logan, you have lower income demographic, and you also have high insurance costs, so therefore your net yield is actually lower. Now, because of that, what happens is you actually make less money even on a cash flow basis after a couple of years, which is actually shocking, but it's true. Now, not only that too, but key to supply and demand too is also what the demographics in the suburb, and not only that too, but it's also the income levels and jobs. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, if there's no jobs available in the area, what happens is that people naturally do not want to live there and they naturally move, especially if they're not fundamentally strong jobs. Now, you don't have really fundamentally strong industries in Logan. In Newcastle, you've got the hospital precinct, medical. You've also got not only that too, but you've got the education. So particularly Newcastle University, you've got John Hunter Cavalry Major Hospital. You've got tech hubs coming up everywhere. You've got small finance companies, a couple of legal firms, and also, like, this isn't a fundamental industry. You also got the basin of the actual Hunter region, which is mining. But on top of that, you've got renewable energy companies coming in, which I'd argue today is a fundamentally strong industry. So there's your reason. Now, furthermore to that, the thing is, you've got a thing called, now gentrification is one thing, but a large part of gentrification often happens due to a thing called the spillover effect. Now, what that is people from wealthier suburbs generally move into suburbs that are cheaper, and it's simply because they can't afford the suburb they're in, but they don't want to be too far away from all their lifestyle areas, all the good things that are in that suburb. Now, Logan has not a single suburb around it that I would consider to be a suburb of wealthier demographics or where people would genuinely want to live. Whereas Mayfield is a suburb where generally people want to live there, simply speaking, because there is some really good nearby suburbs. There's really good jobs nearby. It's very close to the city. It's close to the harbour front. It's close to the beach. And you have suburbs nearby that, have above $2,000 a week median household income that is weekly. So it's just insane. In Logan, you have a suburb next door that has, very low income, and no one really wants to live there because there's crime. So there's your difference. Now, if you don't believe me, here you go. This is actually your census in 2021. Here's a contrast of your postcode. So now, earlier I've said, and in multiple times I've said, demographics drive markets. Now, if you look at this, so you'll notice that your median weekly household income in Logan is $1,376, whereas in Mayfield, it's $1,591. Now, furthermore, what you actually want to do is you want to look in 2021 what the prices of each of them were, and then calculate what your average actual loan value would be based on your mortgage repayments. Now, I'll tell you right now, Logan would have had an LVR above 70. Mayfield would have had one below 60. So you've naturally got people with lower LVRs in a place like Mayfield. Therefore, meaning they don't need to sell and they have more money to actually create, should I say, either redevelop dwellings, renovate and actually improve fixtures and fittings, or in general, just spend it on lifestyle things in the suburb and actually contribute to the economy. So that actually comes into it as well. Anyway, I'll ask you a few other questions. Now, look, you get these buyer's agents and so-called, property experts, which I say property experts, doing things and saying things like, well, there's no way, they'll say things along the lines of, I'm buying properties under market value because, I'm a good buyer's agent because I know what I'm doing and all that kind of thing. Now, in essence, that might be the case in some circumstances, but I guarantee you it's very few. Because I'll tell you right now, if a property came up in the right suburb, it would sell for whatever price the market would determine its worth, and that would be its fair value. Now, if someone is saying that they're buying consistently in a suburb below market value, let me ask you something. What does it tell you about the future of the suburb? It's trash. That's what it tells you. Because at best, the suburb's probably, I'd say, stabilizing. At worst, it's probably going down in value. So just keep that in mind. And I'll ask a rhetorical question. I'll contrast it to the three major states, right? Would someone in Brisbane who's selling the best property on Hamilton Hill that overlooks the whole CBD, the Brisbane River, and is on above an acre in land size with a beautiful flat backyard with beautiful views, do you think if that came to market that would sell under market value? No chance. Do you think that someone in Churruck who's selling a property on St George's Road that is on an acre with 6 bedrooms, a tennis court, a basketball court, 3 kitchens, do you think that would sell under market value? Really? Do you think a property in North Bondi on Ben Buckler, overlooking Bondi Beach with city views as well, do you think on a, let's say, block of land of 600 metres square, do you think that would sell below market value when you have billionaires looking in suburbs like this? You got to remember, the property might be $10 million, right? No doubt. However, you've got billionaires buying in these suburbs. So a billionaire is someone with $1,000 million. Do you think that they care if they spend 10 million, 10.1, 11 million. They don't. I'm telling you that right now, because these assets are commodities, and that's the way you should look at investing in property. If it's a scarce commodity that people want, the value is at fair value, and you want to buy an asset that's going to perform in the long term. As Warren Buffett said, purchase something great at fair value rather than something fair at great value. Simple as that. Now, not only that too, but furthermore, like I'm finally towards the end of this video, and I'm sorry, it has taken so long, but I do really appreciate everyone that's actually stayed on to the end, because it does mean a lot to me. And yeah, look, I hope this hits the people that it needs to help, and I can help a lot more people into the future. That's the general thing I really just want to do here. So anyway, look, this comes to the end of the video, and how I want to sign off is, look, if you're genuinely looking for a buyer's agent, and I do source properties right between your 450,000 above $5 million, please contact me. My website is just www.compoundinvest.com.au. My email is admin@compoundinvest.com.au. And if you actually go to the contact us link, so that's www.compoundinvest.com.au/contact us, you'll find an actual booking section where we can do a short 15-minute or half an hour phone call, and we can discuss what you're actually wanting to do in the future. And yeah, we can go from there. Now, you can call the phone number as well. My suggestion though is, if you're really serious, what I would do is I'd suggest putting a booking in, or simply emailing me, and we can organize something like that. Now, again, look, this is what my website looks like. Very easy to find. Contact us. It's just straight up, sort of in the top middle left of the website. And you can check out some areas that I buy in there. So just scroll down. It's quite user friendly. Look, if you're on a mobile site, it does look a little bit different, but you get the gist of it. Same thing. Just fill out the form and get in touch with me. Furthermore, look, just generally, thanks so much for watching this video. I do really appreciate it. Look, and I really hope that I can help people more and more into the future. I'll try to put a video out every single Sunday, because I think it's really important. Any further questions, please comment below. I think it's really important that everyone does that, just to get the word out there. And please, if you can, share and subscribe to this video and my channel, because look, if you value my time, just simply show that you do by subscribing. And if you need someone that's actually going to help you, I think I'm your guy longer term. Now, I'll do my best to answer all these questions in future videos. Look, my apologies if it seems like I might ignore one or two of them. I don't mean to. It's just simply I'm going to prioritize the best questions that everyone has. It's as simple as that. Now, all I want to say is thank you so much for watching this video. Please like and subscribe and share this with everyone that Thanks again, and welcome to Compound Invest. Cheers.